A millionaire finds a poor little boy passed out in the snow. He decides to take him to live in his mansion. However, one day, he decides to come home early to surprise the boy. The millionaire is completely shocked to see what the boy did to his disabled wife. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the relentless snowfall as Alexander Blackwood navigated his luxury SUV through the treacherous mountain roads. The darkness of Christmas Eve enveloped him, broken only by the harsh glare of his headlights reflecting off the swirling snow. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel, not from fear of the hazardous conditions, but from the weight of memories that pressed down on him with each passing mile. 5 years. It had been 5 years since he had last driven this road on Christmas Eve. 5 years since his world had shattered like the ice on a frozen lake. The thought of his son, James, laughing in the back seat, eagerly anticipating the presents waiting for him at their secluded mansion, was almost more than Alexander could bear. He gritted his teeth, forcing the image from his mind as he had done countless times before. The mansion loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the snow-laden sky. Its windows were lifeless, a stark contrast to the warm glow they once emanated during the holiday season. As Alexander pulled into the circular driveway, he couldn't help but notice the absence of Christmas decorations. No twinkling lights, no cheerful wreath on the door, just cold stone and darker shadows. He stepped out of the car, the biting wind whipping at his expensive overcoat. The crunch of snow under his feet seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness of the night. Alexander paused, looking up at the imposing structure before him. This place, once a sanctuary of joy and family, now stood as a mausoleum to his grief. With a heavy sigh, he made his way to the front door. The key turned smoothly in the lock, and he stepped into the cavernous foyer. The smell of disuse and faint traces of pine cleaner greeted him. Alexander flicked on the lights, wincing at the sudden brightness that seemed to emphasize the emptiness of the space. His footsteps echoed as he moved through the house, turning on lights and adjusting the thermostat. The routine was familiar, almost comforting in its monotony. It was the same every time he visited this place, which wasn't often. Most of the year the mansion stood empty, maintained by a small staff that came weekly to clean and ensure everything was in working order. Alexander made his way to the study, the one room in the house that still felt somewhat like his own. He poured himself a generous measure of scotch from the crystal decanter on the sideboard, then sank into the leather armchair behind the massive oak desk. The amber liquid burned pleasantly as he took a long sip, his eyes drawn to the single-framed photograph on the desk. It was a picture of happier times. Alexander, his wife Catherine, and their son James, all smiling brightly on a sunny beach. Catherine sat in her wheelchair, her eyes sparkling with joy as James hugged her tightly. Alexander stood behind them, one hand on Catherine's shoulder, the other ruffling James's hair. They looked like the perfect family. The memory of that day hit Alexander like a physical blow. He could almost hear the sound of waves crashing on the shore, feel the warmth of the sun on his skin, and see the love in Catherine's eyes as she looked up at him. It was before the accident, before the grief that tore them apart, before Catherine left. With a growl of frustration, Alexander slammed the picture face down on the desk. He couldn't bear to look at it anymore, couldn't stand the reminder of everything he had lost. He took another long drink of scotch, welcoming the burn in his throat and the numbing effect it had on his thoughts. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight, its deep tones reverberating through the empty house. Christmas Day. Once a time of joy and celebration, now just another reminder of his loneliness. Alexander poured himself another drink, determined to drown out the memories that threatened to overwhelm him. As he raised the glass to his lips, a sudden gust of wind rattled the windows. Alexander froze, listening intently. For a moment, he could have sworn he heard a faint cry carried on the wind. He shook his head, attributing the sound to his imagination and the effects of the alcohol. But then he heard it again, a soft, plaintive wail that seemed to come from outside. Alexander set down his glass and moved to the window, peering out into the swirling snow. At first he saw nothing but the white expanse of his front lawn. Then a movement caught his eye. There at the edge of the property, near the road, was a small dark shape huddled in the snow. Alexander squinted, trying to make out what it was. As he watched, the shape moved slightly, and he realized with a start that it was a person, a small person. For a long moment, Alexander stood frozen, his mind racing. It couldn't be. It was impossible. But the shape moved again, and this time he was certain. It was a child alone in the blizzard on Christmas Eve. Without thinking, Alexander rushed from the study, grabbing his coat as he hurried to the front door. The bitter cold hit him like a wall as he stepped outside, but he barely noticed it. His eyes were fixed on the small form in the distance, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and something he couldn't quite name. As he approached, the child became more visible. A boy, no more than 7 or 8 years old, curled up in a thin jacket that offered little protection against the elements. The boy's eyes were closed, his face pale and still. Alexander knelt beside the child, his hands shaking as he reached out to touch the boy's shoulder. "Hey," he called, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Can you hear me?" The boy's eyelids fluttered, but he didn't respond. Alexander could feel the cold radiating from the child's body, and he knew he had to act fast. Without hesitation, he scooped the boy into his arms, cradling him against his chest as he turned back toward the mansion. As he carried the unconscious child through the snow, Alexander's mind raced with questions. Who was this boy? Where had he come from? And why of all the places in the world had he ended up here on this lonely stretch of road, on this of all nights? The answers would have to wait. For now, all that mattered was getting the boy to safety and warmth. As Alexander hurried back to the house, he felt something stir within him, a feeling he had thought long dead. It was concern, yes, but also something more. A spark of purpose, a flicker of hope. For the first time in years, Alexander Blackwood was thinking of someone other than himself. And as he crossed the threshold of his lonely mansion, the child held tightly in his arms. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. The warmth of the mansion enveloped Alexander as he burst through the front door, the unconscious boy cradled in his arms. His mind raced, years of business decisions and calculated risks offering no guidance in this unprecedented situation. For a moment he stood in the foyer, the sound of his ragged breathing echoing off the high ceilings. "Think, Alexander," he muttered to himself, forcing his racing thoughts into order. The guest room, it was the closest and most comfortable space. With renewed purpose he strode through the house, his wet shoes leaving a trail of melting snow on the polished hardwood floors. The guest room was just as he remembered it, pristine and untouched. Alexander gently laid the boy on the king-sized bed, the child's small form looking even tinier against the expanse of the mattress. In the warm light of the bedside lamp, Alexander could finally get a good look at his unexpected guest. The boy's face was pale, his lips tinged with blue. His clothes, a thin jacket, jeans, and worn sneakers, were soaked through. Dark hair, dusted with snow, clung to his forehead. Alexander's heart clenched at the sight. This child couldn't be much older than James had been. He shook his head, banishing the thought. There was no time for painful memories. This boy needed help, and he needed it now. With fumbling fingers, Alexander pulled out his phone and dialed the number for his personal physician, Dr. Elena Martinez. It rang several times before a groggy voice answered. "Dr. Martinez, it's Alexander Blackwood. I need you at the mansion immediately. It's an emergency." There must have been something in his voice because the doctor's tone sharpened instantly. "What's happened, Mr. Blackwood? Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Alexander said quickly. It's a child. I found him in the snow. He's unconscious, possibly hypothermic. I need you here as soon as possible." "I'm on my way," Dr. Martinez replied without hesitation. "In the meantime, get him out of those wet clothes and wrap him in warm blankets. Don't use hot water or try to warm him too quickly. I'll be there in 20 minutes. The line went dead, and Alexander stared at the phone for a moment before springing into action. He moved to the ensuite bathroom, grabbing every towel he could find. Back in the bedroom, he hesitated for just a second before carefully removing the boy's wet clothes. As he worked, Alexander couldn't help but notice how thin the child was, his ribs visible beneath pale skin. There were bruises, too, some old, some new, painting a story of hardship that made Alexander's jaw clench with unexpected anger. He dried the boy as best he could with the towels, then wrapped him in the plush comforter from the bed. Throughout it all, the child remained unconscious, his breathing shallow but steady. Just as Alexander was wondering what else he could do, a soft knock at the door made him turn. Martha, The housekeeper, who had been with the family for decades, stood in the doorway, her eyes wide with surprise and concern. "Mr. Blackwood, I heard noises and thought—" Her voice trailed off as she caught sight of the boy in the bed. "Oh my goodness, what happened?" Alexander ran a hand through his hair, suddenly aware of how disheveled he must look. "I found him outside, Martha. In the snow. Dr. Martinez is on her way, but I could use your help." Martha didn't hesitate. She bustled into the room, her experienced eyes taking in the situation quickly. "Of course, sir. I'll fetch some extra blankets and prepare some warm broth for when he wakes." As Martha hurried off, Alexander found himself grateful for her calm efficiency. He turned back to the boy, adjusting the blankets and checking his breathing for what felt like the 100th time. "Who are you?" he murmured, studying the child's face. "Where did you come from?" As if in response to his questions, the boy's eyelids fluttered. Alexander leaned closer, holding his breath. Slowly, painfully slowly, the child's eyes opened, revealing irises of a startling blue, a blue that sent a jolt of recognition through Alexander's body. For a moment, neither of them moved. The boy blinked, his gaze unfocused at first, then sharpening as he took in his surroundings. When his eyes landed on Alexander, they widened with fear. "It's all right," Alexander said quickly, trying to keep his voice soft and reassuring. "You're safe. I found you in the snow. Do you remember what happened?" The boy's lips moved, but no sound came out. He tried to sit up, but Alexander gently pressed him back into the pillows. "Easy now, you need to rest. What's your name?" The child swallowed hard, then whispered in a voice hoarse from cold and disuse, "Charlie. My name is Charlie." "Hello, Charlie," Alexander replied, surprised by the wave of relief that washed over him at this small communication. "I'm Alexander. Can you tell me how you ended up out there in the snow?" Charlie's eyes darted around the room, fear and confusion evident in his gaze. I ran away," he admitted finally, his voice barely audible. "From the orphanage. They weren't nice there." Alexander felt a surge of that unfamiliar anger again. Before he could respond, however, Charlie's eyes filled with tears. "Please don't send me back," he pleaded, his small hand clutching at Alexander's sleeve. "Please, I'll be good. I'll do anything. Just don't make me go back there." The desperation in the boy's voice struck Alexander like a physical blow. Without thinking, he reached out and took Charlie's hand in his own. "You're not going anywhere," he said firmly. "Not until you're well, at least. And certainly not back to anywhere that wasn't nice." Charlie's grip on his sleeve tightened, and Alexander found himself squeezing the boy's hand gently in return. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental, the first real human connection Alexander had allowed himself in years. The moment was broken by the sound of the doorbell echoing through the house. "That'll be the doctor," Alexander said, carefully extracting his hand from Charlie's grasp. "She's here to make sure you're all right. Will you be okay for a moment while I let her in?" Charlie nodded, though his eyes followed Alexander anxiously as he moved towards the door. At the threshold, Alexander paused and looked back. "I'll be right back," he promised, surprised by how much he meant it. As he hurried to let Dr. Martinez in, Alexander's mind was a whirl with questions and unexpected emotions. Who was this boy really? What would happen to him now? And why did Alexander feel so inexplicably drawn to him? One thing was certain: this Christmas Eve had taken a turn he could never have anticipated. And as he opened the front door to admit the doctor, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that his life would never be quite the same again. The sharp click of Dr. Elena Martinez's heels echoed through the foyer as Alexander led her quickly towards the guest room. Her face, usually calm and professional, bore a hint of concern as she listened to Alexander's hurried explanation. "A boy? In the snow?" she questioned, her brow furrowing. "Mr. Blackwood, this is highly unusual. Have you contacted the authorities?" Alexander hesitated, his hand on the doorknob of the guest room. "Not yet," he admitted. "I wanted to ensure his well-being first. He said he ran away from an orphanage where he was mistreated." Dr. Martinez's expression softened slightly. "I see. Well, let's take a look at him, shall we?" As they entered the room, Charlie's eyes widened with fear at the sight of the doctor. He shrank back against the pillows, his gaze darting between her and Alexander. "It's okay, Charlie," Alexander said, surprised by the gentleness in his own voice. "This is Dr. Martinez. She's here to help you." Dr. Martinez approached the bed with a warm smile. "Hello, Charlie." I hear you've had quite an adventure tonight. Mind if I take a look at you?" Charlie nodded hesitantly, his eyes never leaving Alexander, who found himself moving closer to the bed in response. The next few minutes were a flurry of activity as Dr. Martinez examined Charlie thoroughly. She checked his temperature, listened to his breathing, and gently prodded his limbs for any signs of frostbite. All the while, she kept up a soothing stream of chatter, explaining each step to Charlie in a way that gradually eased the tension from his small frame. Finally, she straightened up and turned to Alexander. "Well, Mr. Blackwood, it seems your quick action may have saved this young man from a much worse fate. He's suffering from mild hypothermia and exhaustion, but with proper care, he should make a full recovery." Alexander felt a weight lift from his shoulders. That's good news," he said, surprised by the depth of relief in his voice. "Doctor." Martinez nodded, her eyes shrewd as she observed the interaction between Alexander and Charlie. "He'll need to stay warm and get plenty of rest. I'd like to see him again in a couple of days to ensure there are no complications. In the meantime," she paused, choosing her words carefully. "Mr. Blackwood, I assume you plan to contact the proper authorities about Charlie's situation." Before Alexander could respond, Charlie let out a small whimper of distress. "Please," he begged, his blue eyes filling with tears. "Please don't make me go back. They'll hurt me again." Alexander felt something twist in his chest at the raw fear in Charlie's voice. Without thinking, he moved to the bed and sat on the edge, placing a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "It's all right, Charlie. No one's going to hurt you. I promised you'd be safe here, remember?" He looked up at Dr. Martinez, his jaw set with sudden determination. "I'll handle the situation, Doctor. For now, Charlie stays here where I can ensure his safety and recovery." "Dr." Martinez raised an eyebrow but nodded slowly. "Very well, Mr. Blackwood. I'll trust your judgment on this, but please do consider seeking proper legal advice on the matter. This is, well, it's a delicate situation." As the doctor packed up her bag and prepared to leave, she pulled Alexander aside. "Mr. Blackwood," she said in a low voice, "I couldn't help but notice the timing of this, considering your history." Alexander stiffened, his expression closing off. "Thank you for your concern, Doctor, but I assure you, I'm perfectly capable of handling this situation." Dr. Martinez held his gaze for a long moment before nodding. "Of course, I'll be back in 2 days to check on Charlie. Please don't hesitate to call if you need anything before then." As the sound of the doctor's car faded into the night, Alexander turned back to the guest room. Charlie was sitting up in bed, his eyes wide and questioning. "Am I really going to stay here?" he asked, his voice small and hesitant. Alexander approached the bed, suddenly unsure of himself. What was he doing? He wasn't equipped to care for a child. He'd failed at that once before, hadn't he? But as he looked into Charlie's hopeful face, he felt something stir within him, a feeling he'd thought long dead. "Yes, Charlie," he said softly. "You're going to stay here for now. We'll figure everything out, I promise." A small smile, the first Alexander had seen, lit up Charlie's face. "Thank you, Mr. Alexander," he whispered. Just then, Martha appeared in the doorway carrying a tray with a steaming bowl of broth. "I thought our young guest might be hungry," she said, her kind eyes taking in the scene before her. As Alexander helped Charlie sit up and Martha set the tray on his lap, he couldn't help but feel that his lonely, empty mansion had suddenly become something else entirely. For the first time in years, it felt like home. But even as he basked in this unexpected warmth, a nagging voice in the back of his mind whispered warnings. Who was this boy, really? And what would happen when the truth of his past came to light? For now, Alexander pushed these thoughts aside. There would be time for questions later. For now, there was only this moment. A scared, brave little boy, a warm bowl of soup, and the first stirrings of hope on a snowy Christmas morning. The soft glow of dawn was just beginning to creep through the windows when Alexander jerked awake, momentarily disoriented. He was slumped in an armchair beside the guest bed, his neck stiff from the awkward position. As the fog of sleep cleared, the events of the night came rushing back, and his eyes immediately sought out the small form in the bed. Charlie was still there, curled up under the blankets, his chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm of deep sleep. Alexander let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Part of him had been afraid that the boy would disappear in the night, that this whole surreal experience had been nothing more than a vivid dream. As he watched Charlie sleep, Alexander couldn't help but be struck by how peaceful the boy looked. Gone was the fear and wariness that had haunted his eyes the night before. In sleep he was just a child, vulnerable, innocent, and somehow familiar in a way that tugged at Alexander's heart. A soft knock at the door drew Alexander's attention. Martha stood in the doorway, a tray of coffee and toast in her hands. "I thought you might need this, sir," she whispered, setting the tray on a nearby table. Alexander nodded gratefully, suddenly aware of how exhausted he felt. "Thank you, Martha. And thank you for your help last night. I'm not sure what I would have done without you." Martha's eyes softened as she looked at Charlie. "It's no trouble at all, Mr. Blackwood. It's nice to have a child in the house again." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken memories. Alexander felt a familiar pang of grief, but it was muted somehow, overshadowed by the presence of the sleeping boy in the bed. As Martha quietly left the room, Alexander sipped his coffee and tried to gather his thoughts. What was he going to do now? He'd made a split-second decision to keep Charlie here, but in the cold light of day, the enormity of that choice was beginning to sink in. A small sound from the bed caught his attention. Charlie was stirring, his eyes blinking open slowly. For a moment, confusion clouded the boy's face. Then his gaze landed on Alexander, and a mixture of relief and apprehension washed over his features. "Good morning, Charlie," Alexander said softly, setting down his coffee cup. "How are you feeling?" Charlie pushed himself up to a sitting position, wincing slightly. "I'm okay," he said, his voice still rough with sleep. I thought maybe I dreamed it all." Alexander smiled, surprising himself with how natural it felt. "No dream. You're safe here, just like I promised." Charlie nodded, his eyes darting around the room as if still trying to convince himself of the reality of his surroundings. His gaze landed on a framed photograph on the dresser, a picture of Alexander, Catherine, and James from years ago. "Is that your family?" Charlie asked hesitantly. Alexander felt the familiar tightness in his chest at the sight of the photo, but he forced himself to nod. "Yes, that was my family." Charlie's brow furrowed at Alexander's use of past tense. "What happened to them?" For a moment, Alexander considered deflecting the question, but something in Charlie's open, curious face made him pause. "My son, James, he passed away a few years ago," Alexander said quietly. "And my wife, well, we're not together anymore." "Oh," Charlie said softly. "I'm sorry. I know what it's like to lose people you love." The simple sincerity in the boy's voice caught Alexander off guard. "You do?" Charlie nodded, his eyes distant. "My parents, they went away when I was little. I don't remember them very well, just feelings, I guess. Warm hugs and bedtime stories." Alexander felt a surge of sympathy for the boy. "Is that when you went to the orphanage?" Charlie's face darkened. "Yeah, it wasn't so bad at first, but then things changed. The new people who ran it, they weren't nice, He trailed off, his small hands clenching the blanket tightly. Alexander found himself moving to sit on the edge of the bed, close to Charlie but not touching him. "It's okay," he said gently. "You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to." Charlie looked up at him, his blue eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "They hurt us sometimes, said we were bad, that nobody wanted us. I tried to be good, I really did. But it never seemed to matter." Alexander felt a surge of anger at the thought of anyone hurting this child. "Listen to me, Charlie," he said, his voice firm but kind. "What they did was wrong. You didn't deserve any of that, and you're safe now, I promise." Charlie wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand. "Really? You won't send me back?" "Really," Alexander assured him. "We'll figure something out. For now, you're staying here." A small smile spread across Charlie's face, lighting up his eyes in a way that made Alexander's breath catch. It was a smile he'd seen before, in another little boy's face, on countless Christmas mornings. The thought brought a fresh wave of grief, but also something else, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. "Now," Alexander said, pushing aside his tumultuous emotions, "how about some breakfast? I'm sure Martha has prepared something delicious." As if on cue, the smell of cinnamon and warm pastry wafted through the door. Charlie's eyes widened. "Is that cinnamon rolls?" Alexander chuckled, the sound surprising even himself. "I believe it is. Martha always made them on Christmas morning. It seems she's reviving the tradition." As he helped Charlie out of bed and into a robe that was comically large on his small frame, Alexander couldn't help but marvel at how quickly his world had changed. Just yesterday, he'd been dreading another lonely, miserable Christmas, and now he was leading a pajama-clad boy down to breakfast, the mansion filled with the warm sense of home and the sound of childish excitement. It wasn't the Christmas he'd expected, but as Charlie's small hand slipped trustingly into his, Alexander realized it might just be the Christmas he needed. But even as warmth bloomed in his chest, a nagging worry persisted in the back of his mind. What would happen when the real world inevitably intruded on this unexpected idyll? And why did he have the unsettling feeling that there was more to Charlie's story than the boy was telling? For now, though, there were cinnamon rolls to be eaten and a Christmas morning to be savored. The future, with all its uncertainties, could wait, at least for a little while. The aroma of cinnamon rolls and freshly brewed coffee filled the spacious kitchen as Alexander and Charlie sat at the breakfast nook. Charlie's eyes were wide with wonder as he took in the gleaming appliances and the expansive view of the snow-covered grounds through the large windows. "This is the biggest kitchen I've ever seen," Charlie said in awe, his small hands wrapped around a mug of hot cocoa. Alexander couldn't help but smile at the boy's amazement. "It's been a while since it's been used properly," he admitted. "I'm not much of a cook myself." As if on cue, Martha bustled in with a fresh batch of cinnamon rolls, the scent making Charlie's eyes light up even more. "Now, young man," she said kindly, placing a roll on Charlie's plate. "You eat up. You need your strength after your ordeal last night." Charlie didn't need to be told twice. He dug into the pastry with gusto, a look of pure bliss spreading across his face at the first bite. Alexander watched him, a strange warmth spreading through his chest. It had been so long since he'd seen someone enjoy a simple pleasure so thoroughly. "Mr. Alexander," Charlie said between bites, "is this really your house? It's like a castle." Alexander chuckled, surprising himself with how natural it felt. "It does feel a bit like that sometimes. It's been in my family for generations." Charlie's face grew serious for a moment. "Did you grow up here?" Alexander nodded, memories washing over him. "I did. And later my son James..." He trailed off, the familiar pang of grief catching him off guard. Charlie seemed to sense the change in mood, his small hand reaching out to touch Alexander's arm hesitantly. "I'm sorry," the boy said softly. "I didn't mean to make you sad." Alexander shook his head, forcing a smile. "It's all right, Charlie. Sometimes it's good to remember, even if it hurts a little." They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the clink of cutlery and the distant howl of the wind outside. Alexander found himself studying Charlie, noting the way the boy's eyes darted around the room, taking everything in with a mix of wonder and wariness. "Charlie," Alexander said gently, "I know you've been through a lot, but I want you to know that you're safe here. No one is going to hurt you." Charlie nodded, his eyes meeting Alexander's with a hint of hope. "I know. You saved me. You're like a superhero or something." Alexander felt a lump form in his throat at the boy's words. He was no hero, far from it. But looking at Charlie's trusting face, he found himself wanting to live up to that expectation. Just as he was about to respond, the sound of a car engine cut through the quiet morning. Alexander frowned, rising to look out the window. A sleek black sedan was making its way up the driveway, leaving tracks in the fresh snow. "That's odd," he muttered. "I'm not expecting anyone." Charlie tensed visibly, his eyes wide with fear. Is it them? Did they find me?" Alexander quickly moved to reassure him. No, it's not them. I promise. Stay here with Martha, all right? I'll go see who it is." As he made his way to the front door, Alexander's mind raced. Who could be visiting on Christmas morning? A nagging suspicion formed in the back of his mind, but he pushed it aside. It couldn't be. He opened the door just as the car came to a stop. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze as he recognized the figure emerging from the driver's seat. Catherine. His estranged wife stood before him, her wheelchair being unfolded by the driver. She looked exactly as he remembered, elegant, composed, with a hint of steel in her grey eyes. Those eyes now fixed on him with a mixture of determination and apprehension. "Hello, Alexander," she said, her voice carrying on the cold air. "Merry Christmas." Alexander stood frozen in the doorway, 1,000 emotions warring within him. "Catherine," he finally managed. "What are you doing here?" She wheeled herself closer, her chin lifted in that familiar, defiant angle. I think we need to talk, don't you? It's been long enough. Before Alexander could respond, a small voice piped up behind him. Mr. Alexander? Who is it? He turned to see Charlie standing in the hallway, curiosity and fear mingling on his young face. Catherine's eyes widened as she caught sight of the boy, her gaze darting between him and Alexander, with obvious confusion. Alexander? She said slowly. Who is this? For a moment, Alexander stood caught between his past and this unexpected present, the weight of unspoken words and buried grief hanging heavy in the air. As the snow began to fall again, soft and silent, he realized that this Christmas was about to become even more complicated than he could have ever imagined. Catherine, he said, his voice steadier than he felt, there's quite a story I need to tell you. Why don't you come inside? As Catherine wheeled past him into the foyer, her eyes never leaving Charlie, Alexander felt the world shifting beneath his feet. Whatever happened next, he knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The tension in the living room was palpable as Alexander helped Catherine settle her wheelchair near the crackling fireplace. Charlie hovered uncertainly in the doorway, his eyes darting between the two adults with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Charlie, Alexander said gently, why don't you go help Martha in the kitchen for a bit? We'll call you when we're done talking. The boy nodded, casting one last glance at Catherine before disappearing down the hallway. As soon as he was out of earshot, Catherine turned to Alexander, her grey eyes sharp with questions. Alexander, what on earth is going on? Who is that child? Alexander sank into the armchair across from her, suddenly feeling the weight of the past 24 hours. His name is Charlie, he began, running a hand through his disheveled hair. I found him last night, half frozen in the snow near the property line. Catherine's eyebrows shot up in disbelief. You found him? Alexander, have you contacted the authorities? His parents must be worried sick. It's not that simple, Alexander said, proceeding to recount the events of the previous night. Finding Charlie, the doctor's visit, and the boy's revelation about the orphanage. As he spoke, Catherine's expression softened from shock to concern. The poor child, she murmured. But Alexander, you can't just keep him here. There are proper channels, procedures. I know, Alexander interrupted, a hint of frustration creeping into his voice. But you didn't see him, Catherine. The fear in his eyes when he thought I might send him back. I couldn't just abandon him. A heavy silence fell between them, filled with unspoken words and shared memories. Finally, Catherine spoke, her voice soft but firm. You're thinking about James, aren't you? The name hung in the air, a ghost that had haunted them both for years. Alexander felt his throat tighten. How can I not? Charlie's about the same age James was when... He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Catherine reached out, hesitating for a moment before placing her hand on his arm. It was the first time they had touched in years, and Alexander felt a jolt at the contact. I know, she said quietly. I see it too, but Alexander, you have to be careful. This boy, as much as he might remind you of James, he's not our son. Alexander nodded, fighting back the emotions threatening to overwhelm him. I know that, Catherine, but I can't help feeling like this is a second chance. A chance to do something right. Catherine studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. You've changed, she said finally. The Alexander I knew would never have opened his home, or his heart, like this. He met her gaze steadily. Maybe I needed to change. Maybe we both did. The unspoken years of grief, anger, and regret stretched between them. Catherine's hand still rested on his arm, a tentative bridge across the chasm of their shared past. Why are you here, Catherine? Alexander asked softly. After all this time? She withdrew her hand, smoothing imaginary wrinkles from her skirt. I came to discuss the foundation, she said, her businesslike tone a stark contrast to the emotional weight of their conversation. For the annual meeting is coming up, and there are some decisions that need to be made. Alexander nodded, remembering the charitable foundation they had established in James's memory. It had been one of the few things that had kept them connected over the years, a shared mission born from their grief. Of course, he said. We can discuss it later. For now, he hesitated, unsure how to proceed. Would you like to meet Charlie properly? Catherine seemed to consider for a moment before nodding. Yes, I think I would. As if on cue, a small knock sounded at the door. Charlie peeked in, his eyes wide and questioning. "Mr. Alexander, Martha said to tell you the hot chocolate is ready." Alexander smiled, gesturing for the boy to come in. "Perfect timing, Charlie. There's someone I'd like you to meet." Charlie approached cautiously, his gaze fixed on Catherine. "Hello," he said shyly. Catherine's face softened as she looked at the boy. "Hello, Charlie. I'm Catherine. I'm an old friend of Alexander's." Charlie's eyes lit up with recognition. "Oh, you're the lady from the picture in my room. The one in the wheelchair." A flash of surprise crossed Catherine's face, followed quickly by a gentle smile. "That's right. You're very observant." As Charlie began to chat animatedly about the mansion and how kind Alexander had been, Catherine shot her estranged husband a look that spoke volumes. There was surprise there and something else, a glimmer of the connection they had once shared. Alexander found himself watching them both, marveling at how quickly Charlie had gone from fearful to chatty. The boy's resilience was remarkable, and he felt that familiar tug at his heart. But even as warmth spread through him at the scene before him, a nagging worry persisted. What would happen when the real world inevitably intruded on this fragile new dynamic? And why did he have the unsettling feeling that there was more to Charlie's story, and to Catherine's unexpected visit, than met the eye? As Charlie regaled Catherine with tales of the castle he was staying in, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the precipice of something profound. The ghosts of their past swirled around them, but for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope for the future. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he was beginning to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, this unexpected Christmas miracle might be the key to healing wounds he had long thought beyond repair. The afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of the study, casting long shadows across the room. Alexander stood by the fireplace, lost in thought, as he watched Charlie and Catherine engaged in an animated conversation on the sofa. The scene before him felt surreal. His estranged wife and this mysterious boy who had quite literally appeared out of the snow, chatting as if they'd known each other for years. "And then," Charlie was saying, his eyes wide with excitement, "Mr. Alexander made hot chocolate with extra marshmallows." "I've never had that many marshmallows before." Catherine laughed, a sound that Alexander hadn't heard in far too long. "Well, it sounds like you've had quite the adventure, Charlie." As Alexander watched, he couldn't help but notice how natural Catherine seemed with the boy. Her usual reserve had melted away, replaced by a warmth he'd almost forgotten she possessed. It stirred memories of happier times, of Catherine reading bedtime stories to James, her voice full of life and love. "Mr. Alexander?" Charlie's voice broke through his reverie. "Can I show Mrs. Catherine the library? Please?" Alexander blinked, brought back to the present. "Of course, if Catherine doesn't mind." Catherine smiled, adjusting her position in the wheelchair. "I'd love to see it, Charlie. It's been a long time since I've been in that part of the house." As Charlie eagerly led the way, chattering about the millions of books he'd seen earlier, Alexander found himself hanging back, watching the unlikely pair disappear down the hallway. He felt a complex mix of emotions: joy at seeing Charlie so animated, a bittersweet ache at the memories Catherine's presence evoked, and an undercurrent of anxiety about the uncertain future. Deciding to give them a moment alone, Alexander made his way to the kitchen where Martha was preparing dinner. The old housekeeper looked up as he entered, a knowing glint in her eye. "It's good to see Mrs. Blackwood again," she said, her tone carefully neutral. Alexander nodded, leaning against the counter. "Yes, it is, though I'm not entirely sure why she's really here." Martha raised an eyebrow. "Perhaps the same reason you are, Mr. Blackwood. Sometimes the holidays have a way of bringing people back to where they belong." Before Alexander could respond, the sound of the doorbell echoed through the house. Frowning, he made his way to the front door, wondering who else could be arriving unannounced on Christmas Day. He opened the door to find a tall, distinguished-looking man in a crisp suit, seemingly unperturbed by the cold. "Mr. Blackwood?" the man inquired, his tone professional. "I'm Richard Hawthorne from Child Protective Services. I understand you have a young boy here?" Alexander felt his heart rate quicken. "How did you—" "Dr. Martinez contacted us," Mr. Hawthorne explained, his expression unreadable. "She was concerned about the unusual circumstances. May I come in?" Reluctantly, Alexander stepped aside to let the man enter. As he closed the door, he could hear Charlie's laughter echoing from the direction of the library. The sound, so carefree and innocent, now felt fragile in the face of this new threat. "Mr. Hawthorne," Alexander began, trying to keep his voice steady, "I can explain." "I'm sure you can, Mr. Blackwood," the CPS agent interrupted smoothly, "and I look forward to hearing it. But first I'll need to speak with the boy." Just then, Catherine appeared at the end of the hallway, Charlie by her side. The boy's smile faltered as he caught sight of the stranger, and he instinctively moved closer to Catherine. "Alexander," Catherine called, her voice laced with concern. "What's going on?" As Alexander struggled to find the right words, he saw fear creep into Charlie's eyes. The boy looked from Alexander to the CPS agent, then back to Catherine, his small frame tensing as if preparing to bolt. "It's okay, Charlie," Alexander said quickly, trying to project a calm he didn't feel. "This is Mr. Hawthorne. He just wants to talk to us." Charlie shook his head, backing away. "No," he whispered, his voice trembling. "No, you promised. You promised you wouldn't send me back." Before anyone could react, Charlie turned and ran, disappearing down the hallway. The sound of his footsteps faded, followed by the slam of a distant door. For a moment, everyone stood frozen. Then Catherine spoke, her voice sharp with authority. "I think," she said, fixing Mr. Hawthorne with a steely gaze, "that we all need to sit down and discuss this calmly, without frightening the child any further." Mr. Hawthorne nodded, though his expression remained impassive. "Of course, Mrs. Blackwood. I assure you my only concern is for the boy's welfare." As they made their way to the study, Alexander caught Catherine's eye. The look they shared was one of solidarity. Whatever their past differences, they were united in their desire to protect Charlie. But even as Alexander tried to focus on the impending conversation, he couldn't shake the image of Charlie's terrified face. What had the boy been through that made him so afraid? And why did Alexander have the nagging feeling that there was more to Charlie's story than any of them knew? As he closed the study door behind them, Alexander silently vowed to get to the bottom of the mystery surrounding Charlie. But first he had to convince Mr. Hawthorne that the boy was safe and cared for right where he was, in this unexpected family that was forming in the most unlikely of circumstances. The study, once a sanctuary of quiet contemplation, now thrummed with tension. Alexander sat behind his desk, fingers steepled, watching as Mr. Hawthorne settled into one of the leather armchairs. Catherine positioned her wheelchair next to Alexander, presenting a united front that surprised even her. "Now then," Mr. Hawthorne began, pulling out a notepad, "perhaps you could start by explaining how the boy came to be in your care, Mr. Blackwood." Alexander took a deep breath, recounting the events of the previous night, finding Charlie in the snow, the doctor's visit, the boy's fear of returning to the orphanage. As he spoke, he could feel Catherine's gaze on him, a mix of concern and something else he couldn't quite identify. Mr. Hawthorne listened impassively, jotting down notes. When Alexander finished, the CPS agent looked up, his expression neutral. "And you didn't think to contact the authorities immediately?" "I was more concerned with ensuring Charlie's health and safety," Alexander replied, a hint of defiance in his tone. The boy was terrified of being sent back to a place where he was mistreated. "Alleged mistreatment," Mr. Hawthorne corrected smoothly. "We have no evidence of any wrongdoing at the orphanage in question." Catherine leaned forward, her eyes flashing. "With all due respect, Mr. Hawthorne, the fear in that child's eyes is evidence enough. Something traumatic happened to him, whether it's on record or not." The CPS agent turned his attention to Catherine. "Mrs. Blackwood, I understand your concern, but we have procedures in place for a reason. Taking in a child without proper vetting or legal channels is a serious matter." "We're well aware of that," Alexander interjected, "but surely you can understand the unique circumstances. It was Christmas Eve. A blizzard was raging." "Mr. Blackwood," Hawthorne interrupted, his tone sharpening, "I have to ask, given your history, are you certain you're thinking clearly about this situation?" A heavy silence fell over the room. Alexander felt as if all the air had been sucked out, the old grief threatening to overwhelm him. But before he could respond, Catherine's hand found his, squeezing gently. "Our past," she said firmly, "has nothing to do with the present situation. We are two responsible adults who acted to save a child's life. Surely that counts for something in your assessment." Mr. Hawthorne's expression softened slightly. "Of course it does. But you must understand I have to consider all aspects of the situation. The boy's well-being is my primary concern. Just then, a soft knock at the door drew everyone's attention. Martha poked her head in, her face lined with worry. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I can't find Charlie anywhere. I've looked all over the house. Alexander stood up abruptly, his heart racing. What do you mean you can't find him? He's not in his room or the library or any of the usual spots, Martha explained. And I found this on his bed. She held out a crumpled piece of paper. Alexander took it with trembling hands, smoothing it out to read the childish scrawl. Dear Mr. Alexander and Mrs. Catherine, I'm sorry for causing trouble. You've been so nice to me, but I don't want to make things hard for you. Don't worry about me, I'll be okay. Thank you for everything. Charlie? Oh God, Alexander breathed, passing the note to Catherine. He must have overheard us. He thinks we're sending him away. Catherine read the note quickly, her face paling. We have to find him. He can't be out there alone in this weather. Mr. Hawthorne stood, his professional demeanor cracking slightly to reveal genuine concern. I'll contact the local authorities. We need to organize a search party immediately. As they rushed from the study, Alexander's mind raced. How could he have let this happen? He'd promised Charlie he'd be safe, and now the boy was out there somewhere, alone and afraid. The group split up, searching every nook and cranny of the sprawling mansion. Alexander found himself in James's old room, a space he'd avoided for years. As he looked around frantically for any sign of Charlie, his eye caught on something out of place. There, peeking out from under the bed, was a small sneaker, one he recognized as Charlie's. Catherine, Mr. Hawthorne, he called out, dropping to his knees to peer under the bed. Charlie, are you under there? A muffled sniffle was his only answer. Slowly, carefully, Alexander reached out. It's okay, Charlie. You're not in trouble. We've been so worried about you. After what felt like an eternity, a small hand grasped his. Alexander gently helped Charlie crawl out from his hiding place, gathering the trembling boy into his arms. I'm sorry, Charlie whispered, his face buried in Alexander's shoulder. I didn't want to make things worse. Oh, Charlie, Alexander murmured, his voice thick with emotion. You haven't made anything worse. We're just glad you're safe. Catherine wheeled into the room, followed closely by Mr. Hawthorne. The relief on their faces was palpable. Charlie, Catherine said softly, reaching out to touch the boy's arm. We're not sending you away. We want to help you, to keep you safe. Do you understand? Charlie looked up, his blue eyes wide and questioning. Really? But the man said... Mr. Hawthorne stepped forward, his stern demeanor softening as he addressed Charlie directly. I'm not here to take you away, Charlie. I just need to make sure you're being properly cared for. Can you tell me a bit about yourself? About where you came from? Charlie hesitated, looking from Alexander to Catherine and back to Mr. Hawthorne. Then, in a small voice, he began to speak. I don't remember much from before the orphanage. Just flashes. A woman singing, a man laughing. And then, nothing. As Charlie continued, haltingly describing his time at the orphanage and his decision to run away, Alexander felt a fierce protectiveness well up inside him. He met Catherine's gaze over Charlie's head and saw his own determination mirrored there. Whatever it took, whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, for Charlie's sake and perhaps for their own healing as well. As the sun began to set on this most unexpected Christmas day, Alexander realized that the mystery surrounding Charlie was far from solved. But for now, with the boy safe in his arms and Catherine by his side, he felt a glimmer of hope he hadn't experienced in years. The road ahead would be difficult, full of legal hurdles and emotional minefields. But looking at the unlikely family gathered in this room, a broken man, his estranged wife, a lost boy, and even the stern CPS agent who seemed to be softening by the minute, Alexander couldn't help but feel that they were on the cusp of something extraordinary. As Charlie's story unfolded, piece by fragmented piece, Alexander silently vowed to uncover the truth of the boy's past. Not just for Charlie's sake, but for all of them, because somehow in the span of a single day, this child had become the key to unlocking a future none of them could have imagined. The crackling fire in the study cast a warm glow over the room, a stark contrast to the tension that still lingered in the air. Hawthorne had left an hour ago, promising to return in a few days with more information and to check on Charlie's well-being. Now, Alexander sat in his leather armchair, watching as Catherine gently tucked a blanket around a sleeping Charlie on the sofa. "He's exhausted," Catherine whispered, her hand lingering on the boy's tousled hair. "Poor thing's been through so much." Alexander nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Catherine, I want to thank you for backing me up with Hawthorne, for understanding about Charlie." Catherine turned to face him, her eyes soft in the firelight. "Of course, Alexander. Whatever our differences, we both know what it's like to lose a child, to want to protect one." The unspoken name of their son hung in the air between them. For a moment they were both lost in memories, birthdays, Christmases, the sound of James's laughter echoing through the halls of this very house. "Do you think we're doing the right thing?" Alexander asked quietly, voicing the doubt that had been gnawing at him. "Taking Charlie in like this?" Catherine was silent for a long moment, her gaze returning to the sleeping boy. "I don't know," she admitted finally, "but I do know that we couldn't have done anything else. He needs us, Alexander, and maybe we need him too." Before Alexander could respond, Charlie stirred in his sleep, his face scrunching up as if in distress. "No," he mumbled, his small hands clenching the blanket. "Please, don't." Without hesitation, Catherine moved to the boy's side, her hand gently stroking his forehead. "Shh, it's all right, Charlie," she soothed. "You're safe. No one's going to hurt you." As if by magic, Charlie's features relaxed, his breathing evening out once more. Alexander watched in awe as Catherine continued to comfort the boy, her touch so natural, so maternal. It was a side of her he hadn't seen in years, one he'd feared was lost forever after James's passing. "He said something earlier," Alexander said softly, not wanting to wake Charlie. "When Hawthorne was questioning him, about flashes of memory, a woman singing, a man laughing. Do you think," Catherine met his gaze, understanding dawning in her eyes. "You think he might be remembering his parents before the orphanage?" Alexander nodded. "It's possible, and if so, it might help us trace his history, find out where he really came from." "But why can't he remember more?" Catherine mused, her brow furrowing. "Trauma, perhaps. Or maybe—" She trailed off, but Alexander could see the wheels turning in her mind. It was an expression he knew well from their years together. Catherine on the verge of piecing together a puzzle. "What is it?" he prompted. Catherine hesitated, then spoke in a low voice. "It might be nothing, but do you remember that case we heard about a few years ago? The one with the children who were relocated after a certain incident?" Alexander's eyes widened as the memory surfaced. "The Witness Protection Program. But surely—" "I'm not saying that's what happened," Catherine clarified quickly, "but it might explain the gaps in his memory, the fear of authorities." As they discussed the possibilities in hushed tones, neither noticed that Charlie's eyes had fluttered open. The boy lay still, listening to their conversation with a mix of fear and curiosity. "Either way," Alexander said finally, "we need to tread carefully. If there's more to Charlie's past than we know, we could be opening a can of worms by digging too deep." Catherine nodded, her hand finding Alexander's in a gesture of solidarity that surprised them both. "We'll figure it out together," she said softly, "for Charlie's sake." As if on cue, Charlie let out a small yawn, alerting the adults to his wakefulness. "Mr. Alexander, Mrs. Catherine," he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. "Is everything okay?" Alexander moved to kneel beside the sofa, offering Charlie a reassuring smile. "Everything's fine, Charlie. How are you feeling?" Charlie sat up slowly, his gaze darting between Alexander and Catherine. "I'm okay. I'm sorry for hiding earlier. I didn't mean to scare anyone." "Oh, sweetheart," Catherine said, her voice full of warmth. "You don't need to apologize. We understand why you were frightened." Charlie nodded, then hesitated, as if gathering his courage. Can I ask you something?" "Of course," Alexander replied. "Anything." "Are you—" Charlie paused, his lower lip trembling slightly. "Are you going to be my new mom and dad?" The question hung in the air, laden with hope and fear and 1,000 unspoken emotions. Alexander felt his heart constrict, memories of James threatening to overwhelm him. He looked to Catherine, seeing his own turmoil reflected in her eyes. But there was something else there too, a determination, a spark of the woman he'd fallen in love with all those years ago. Catherine reached out, taking one of Charlie's hands in hers and one of Alexander's in the other. "Charlie," she said gently, "we don't know exactly what the future holds. But I want you to know that no matter what happens, you are safe here. We care about you very much, and we're going to do everything we can to make sure you're happy and protected. Okay?" Charlie nodded, his blue eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Okay," he whispered. As Alexander watched Charlie lean into Catherine's embrace, he felt something shift inside him. The pain of the past was still there, a dull ache that might never fully heal, but alongside it there was something new blossoming. Hope, possibility, the chance for a new kind of family. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever secrets Charlie's past might hold, Alexander knew one thing for certain: they would face it together, as a family. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed softly, marking the end of this extraordinary Christmas day. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in white. But inside the Blackwood mansion, a warmth had taken root, one that no winter chill could touch. The days following Christmas unfolded in a blur of activity and emotion. Alexander, who had grown accustomed to the silence of his self-imposed isolation, now found the mansion filled with the sounds of life. Charlie's laughter echoing through the halls, Catherine's wheelchair humming as she moved from room to room, the constant buzz of phone calls and hushed conversations as they navigated the complex legal waters of Charlie's situation. On the morning of December 28th, Alexander stood at the kitchen window, nursing a cup of coffee and watching as Catherine taught Charlie how to make snow angels in the backyard. The sight brought a lump to his throat. It was a scene so achingly familiar, yet entirely new. "They seem to be getting along well," Martha commented as she bustled around the kitchen preparing breakfast. Alexander nodded, unable to take his eyes off the pair. It's remarkable, isn't it? How quickly things can change." Martha placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Life has a way of surprising us, Mr. Blackwood, sometimes in the most wonderful ways." As if on cue, the back door burst open, and Charlie tumbled in, his cheeks rosy from the cold and his eyes bright with excitement. "Mr. Alexander, Mrs. Catherine showed me how to make the perfect snow angel. Can we go sledding later, please?" Alexander couldn't help but chuckle at the boy's enthusiasm. "We'll see, Charlie. Why don't you go get warmed up and changed for breakfast? We've got a busy day ahead." As Charlie scampered off, Catherine wheeled herself into the kitchen, snowflakes melting in her hair. "That boy has more energy than a power plant," she said, laughing. "I'd forgotten how exhausting it can be to keep up with a child." Alexander handed her a steaming mug of coffee. "You're wonderful with him, Catherine. It's good to see you smile again." A moment of understanding passed between them, memories of darker days when smiles were rare and laughter non-existent. Catherine reached out, her gloved hand resting lightly on Alexander's arm. "It's good to have reasons to smile again," she said softly. The moment was interrupted by the shrill ring of the telephone. Alexander answered it, his expression growing serious as he listened to the caller. "That was Jessica Chen, the lawyer," he said as he hung up. "She's coming over this afternoon to discuss our options regarding Charlie's custody situation." Catherine nodded, her face mirroring Alexander's concern. "We knew this was coming. We'll face it together, right?" "Together," Alexander agreed, the word feeling both foreign and right on his tongue. The rest of the morning passed in a flurry of activity. Charlie, sensing the adult's preoccupation, threw himself into helping Martha bake cookies, a task that resulted in more flour on the floor than in the mixing bowl, but filled the house with warmth and the scent of vanilla. As the afternoon approached, Alexander found himself in the study, poring over legal documents and trying to make sense of the complex web of child custody laws. He was so engrossed that he didn't notice Charlie slip into the room until the boy was standing right beside his chair. "Mr. Alexander," Charlie said hesitantly, Are you trying to find out where I came from?" Alexander set down the papers, turning to give Charlie his full attention. "Yes, Charlie. We're trying to understand your situation better so we can help you. Is that okay?" Charlie nodded slowly, his small face scrunched in concentration. "I've been trying to remember more about before, but it's all fuzzy, like looking through a really dirty window." Alexander felt his heart constrict at the frustration in Charlie's voice. "That's okay, Charlie. Memory can be tricky, especially when we've been through difficult things." "You don't need to push yourself." "But I want to remember," Charlie insisted, his blue eyes intense. I want to know why they left me." The raw pain in the boy's voice was almost too much to bear. Without thinking, Alexander pulled Charlie into a gentle hug. "Oh, Charlie, I don't know why things happened the way they did, but I want you to know something very important. Whatever happened in the past, it wasn't your fault. You are a wonderful, brave boy, and you deserve to be loved and cared for." Charlie clung to him, his small frame shaking with silent sobs. Alexander held him, murmuring soothing words and fighting back his own tears. He looked up to see Catherine in the doorway, her eyes glistening as she watched the scene unfold. As Charlie's sobs subsided, Catherine wheeled closer. "Charlie, sweetheart," she said gently, "Alexander and I want you to know that no matter what happens, no matter what we find out about your past, we're here for you. We care about you very much." Charlie pulled back slightly, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "Really? Even if I'm not who you think I am?" Alexander and Catherine exchanged a puzzled glance. "What do you mean, Charlie?" Alexander asked carefully. The boy hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished locket. I found this. In the attic. It has a picture inside of a lady who looks kind of like Mrs. Catherine, and a little boy who—" He trailed off, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. With trembling hands, Alexander took the locket. As he opened it, he felt the world tilt on its axis. There, in faded sepia tones, was a photograph he'd thought lost forever. Catherine, years younger, holding a laughing toddler with bright blue eyes. James. Alexander looked from the photo to Charlie, his mind reeling. The resemblance was uncanny. The same eyes, the same smile. But how? It was impossible, wasn't it? As the implications of what they were seeing began to sink in, the doorbell rang, signaling the arrival of the lawyer. Alexander, Catherine, and Charlie stood frozen, the locket between them like a ticking bomb of truth about to explode. Whatever answers lay ahead, one thing was certain. Their lives were about to change in ways none of them could have imagined. The mystery of Charlie's past was unraveling, thread by delicate thread, and with it, the future of this unexpected family hung in the balance. The study seemed to shrink around them as Alexander, Catherine, and Charlie stared at the open locket, the weight of its implications hanging heavy in the air. The doorbell chimed again, insistent and intrusive, breaking the spell that had fallen over the trio. "I'll get it," Martha's voice called from the hallway, followed by the sound of the front door opening and muffled greetings. Alexander snapped the locket shut, his mind racing. "Charlie," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion, "where exactly did you find this?" Charlie's eyes were wide, darting between Alexander and Catherine. "In a box in the attic. I was exploring and—" "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have been snooping. Are you mad?" "No, sweetheart, we're not mad," Catherine assured him, reaching out to squeeze his hand. "We're just surprised." Before they could discuss further, Martha appeared in the doorway, followed by a sharp-looking woman in a crisp suit. "Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood, Ms. Jessica Chen is here," Martha announced, her eyes taking in the tense scene before her. Alexander straightened, tucking the locket into his pocket. "Thank you, Martha. Ms. Chen, please come in. This is Charlie." Jessica Chen's professional smile faltered slightly as she took in the boy's appearance, her gaze lingering on his startlingly blue eyes. "It's nice to meet you, Charlie," she said, recovering quickly. "Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood, perhaps we should speak privately." Catherine shook her head firmly. "Anything regarding Charlie's situation can be discussed with him present. He has a right to know what's happening." Ms. Chen nodded, though her expression remained skeptical. "Very well. Shall we sit?" As they arranged themselves around the study, Alexander behind his desk, Catherine beside him, Charlie perched nervously on the edge of the sofa. Ms. Chen pulled out a thick folder. "I've been looking into Charlie's case," she began, her tone businesslike. "It's complicated, to say the least. The orphanage he claims to have run away from has no record of a child matching his description." "What?" Alexander leaned forward, frowning. "How is that possible?" Ms. Chen spread her hands. "That's what we're trying to figure out. It's as if Charlie simply appeared out of thin air the night you found him, Mr. Blackwood." Charlie squirmed in his seat, his face pale. "But I'm not lying. I really was there, I swear." "No one's saying you're lying, Charlie," Catherine soothed, though her own voice trembled slightly. We're just trying to understand. Ms. Chen continued, her eyes on her notes. There's more. I've put out inquiries to various agencies, looking for any missing children reports that might match Charlie's description. So far, nothing. It's as if he doesn't exist in any official records. A heavy silence fell over the room. Alexander's hand went to his pocket, feeling the weight of the locket. He exchanged a glance with Catherine, seeing his own turmoil reflected in her eyes. Ms. Chen, Alexander said slowly, what if Charlie isn't who we thought he was? What if he's actually... He couldn't bring himself to finish the sentence. The lawyer's eyebrows shot up. Mr. Blackwood, what exactly are you suggesting? With a deep breath, Alexander pulled out the locket and handed it to Ms. Chen. Charlie found this in our attic. Look at the photograph inside. As Ms. Chen examined the locket, her professional composure cracked. This is... But how? Your son passed away, Catherine finished, her voice barely above a whisper. Or so we thought. Charlie, who had been listening with growing confusion and fear, suddenly spoke up. I don't understand. Who am I? Alexander moved to kneel in front of Charlie, taking the boy's small hands in his. Charlie, we don't know for sure yet, but this photograph, it shows our son, James, and you look so much like him. Charlie's eyes widened, filling with tears. But I'm not James, I'm Charlie. I remember the orphanage, and before that. What do you remember, sweetheart? Catherine asked gently, wheeling closer. Charlie screwed up his face in concentration. Flashes. A car, screaming. And then, nothing. Just the orphanage. Ms. Chen, who had been listening intently, suddenly straightened. Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood, if you're suggesting what I think you are, we need to proceed very carefully. We'll need DNA tests, official investigations. This could have enormous legal implications. Alexander nodded, feeling simultaneously numb and more alive than he had in years. We understand. Whatever it takes to get to the truth. As Miss Chen began outlining the next steps, detailing the complex legal process ahead of them, Alexander found himself watching Charlie. The boy sat quietly, his face a mixture of hope and fear, confusion and longing. Regardless of what the tests might show, regardless of whether Charlie was truly their long-lost son or a miraculous doppelganger, Alexander knew one thing with absolute certainty. This child had become a part of their family, and he would do whatever it took to protect him and give him the love and security he deserved. As the meeting wound down and Ms. Chen prepared to leave, Charlie tugged on Alexander's sleeve. Mr. Alexander, he whispered, even if I'm not really James, can I still stay with you and Mrs. Catherine? Alexander felt his heart swell with an emotion he couldn't quite name. He looked to Catherine, seeing his own feelings mirrored in her tear-filled eyes. Oh, Charlie, he said, pulling the boy into a gentle hug. No matter what, you'll always have a home with us. Always. As the three of them embraced, the weight of the past and the uncertainty of the future seemed to lift, if only for a moment. They were in uncharted waters, facing a mystery none of them could have imagined. But they would face it together as a family, unexpected, unconventional, but bound by something stronger than blood. Love. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed 6 times, its deep tones reverberating through the now silent mansion. Ms. Chen had left an hour ago, leaving behind a whirlwind of paperwork, instructions, and the promise of further investigations. Now Alexander, Catherine, and Charlie sat in the living room, the weight of possibilities hanging heavy in the air. Charlie was curled up on the sofa, his small frame dwarfed by a thick blanket Martha had draped over him. His eyes were red-rimmed from crying, darting between Alexander and Catherine as if afraid they might disappear if he looked away for too long. Are you hungry, sweetheart? Catherine asked gently, breaking the silence that had fallen over them. Martha could whip up some hot chocolate and sandwiches. Charlie shook his head, then hesitated. Maybe some hot chocolate, he said in a small voice. Alexander nodded, grateful for something to do. I'll go ask Martha. Be right back. As he made his way to the kitchen, Alexander's mind raced. The possibility that Charlie might be James, their James, alive after all these years, was almost too much to comprehend. He found himself studying every inch of the boy's face, searching for similarities, for proof of the impossible. In the kitchen, Martha was already preparing a tray of hot chocolate and cookies, as if she'd sensed their need for comfort food. "How are you holding up, Mr. Blackwood?" she asked, her kind eyes full of concern. Alexander ran a hand through his hair, suddenly feeling every one of his years. "I don't know, Martha. It's all so overwhelming. If Charlie really is James, where has he been all this time? What happened to him? And if he's not—" He trailed off, unable to voice the alternative. Martha placed a comforting hand on his arm. "Whatever the truth is, that boy needs you and Mrs. Blackwood. And maybe, just maybe, you both need him too." Nodding gratefully, Alexander took the tray and headed back to the living room. He found Catherine and Charlie engaged in quiet conversation, their heads close together. "Everything okay?" he asked, setting down the tray. Catherine looked up, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Charlie was just telling me about a dream he's been having. A recurring one." Alexander sat down, his interest piqued. "What kind of dream, Charlie?" Charlie wrapped his hands around the warm mug of hot chocolate, his brow furrowed in concentration. "It's always the same. I'm in a car, and it's raining really hard. There's a loud noise, and then everything goes spinny. And then I'm floating in water, and someone's calling a name. But I can never hear what name they're calling." Alexander and Catherine exchanged a glance, both thinking of that terrible night years ago when they'd lost James. The car accident, the storm, the search parties combing the river. "Charlie," Catherine said gently, "can you remember anything else? Anything at all about your life before the orphanage?" Charlie shook his head, frustration evident on his young face. "It's all blurry, like looking through a foggy window. Sometimes I think I remember a big house, kind of like this one, and a lady singing, but then it slips away." Alexander leaned forward, his heart pounding. "Charlie, I know this is confusing and scary, but I want you to know that no matter what we find out, no matter who you turn out to be, Catherine and we care about you. Very much." Charlie's eyes filled with tears again. "Even if I'm not really James." "Oh, sweetheart," Catherine said, reaching out to take his hand. "Even if you're not James, you're still Charlie. And Charlie is a wonderful, brave boy who has become very important to us." A small smile flickered across Charlie's face. "I like being here with you," he admitted. "It feels safe, like I belong." The simple honesty of his words struck Alexander like a physical blow. He thought of all the years he'd spent shutting himself away, drowning in grief and bitterness. And now, in the span of a few days, this child had brought light and warmth back into their lives. "Charlie," Alexander said, his voice thick with emotion, "I want you to know something. Whatever happens next, whatever the tests show, you will always have a home here with us if you want it." Charlie's eyes widened. "Really? You mean I could stay? Even if I'm not James?" Catherine nodded, her smile watery but genuine. "Really. We may not know exactly who you are yet, Charlie, but we know who you are to us. Your family." The boy's face lit up with a joy so pure it made Alexander's heart ache. Without warning, Charlie launched himself off the sofa, flinging his arms around both Alexander and Catherine in an awkward but heartfelt group hug. For a long moment they stayed like that, this unconventional family unit, bound together by circumstance and growing love. Alexander felt something shift inside him, a warmth he'd thought long extinguished rekindling in his chest. As they pulled apart, all a bit misty-eyed, Alexander cleared his throat. "Now what do you say we get to those cookies before they get cold?" Charlie grinned, reaching for a chocolate chip cookie. Can we maybe look at some old photo albums later, of James? I want to see if I can remember anything." Catherine nodded, her hand finding Alexander's and squeezing gently. "I think that's a wonderful idea, Charlie. We'll do it together." As they settled in for an evening of shared memories and cautious hope, Alexander couldn't help but marvel at the twists and turns of fate. A week ago, he'd been a broken man, lost in his grief and isolation. Now, he was part of this strange, beautiful new family unit, embarking on a journey to uncover the truth about Charlie's identity. Whatever that truth might be, Alexander knew one thing for certain: his life and his heart would never be the same again. And for the first time in years, he found himself looking forward to the future, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, together. The days following the revelation about Charlie's possible identity passed in a whirlwind of activity. The Blackwood mansion, once a tomb of silent grief, now buzzed with life and purpose. Alexander found himself navigating a complex web of legal procedures, medical appointments, and emotional highs and lows that left him both exhilarated and exhausted. On a crisp morning in early January, Alexander stood in the doorway of the sunroom, watching as Catherine and Charlie pored over old photo albums. The sight still caught him off guard sometimes. His estranged wife and this boy who might be their long-lost son, heads bent together, laughing over some shared joke. "Oh, look at this one," Charlie exclaimed, pointing to a photograph. "Is that James at the beach?" Catherine nodded, her eyes soft with memory. "Yes, that was our last family vacation before the accident. James loved the ocean. He could spend hours building sandcastles and chasing waves." Alexander felt a familiar pang in his chest at the mention of that time, but it was dulled now, softened by the presence of Charlie and the rekindling of his relationship with Catherine. "Mr. Alexander?" Charlie's voice broke through his reverie. "Can we go to the beach sometime? I've never seen the ocean." The simple request, so full of hope and innocence, nearly undid Alexander. "Of course we can, Charlie," he managed, his voice thick with emotion. "When the weather warms up, we'll plan a trip." The boy's face lit up with a smile so reminiscent of James that Alexander had to look away for a moment, blinking back tears. The sound of the doorbell interrupted the moment. Martha's voice called out, "Mr. Blackwood, Dr. Harriman is here for Charlie's appointment." Alexander straightened, taking a deep breath to compose himself. "Coming, Martha. Charlie, are you ready?" Charlie nodded, though Alexander could see a flicker of apprehension in the boy's eyes. This would be their third appointment with Dr. Harriman, a specialist in pediatric trauma and memory recovery. The sessions had been emotionally draining for all of them, but especially for Charlie. As they made their way to the study where Dr. Harriman was setting up, Catherine reached out and squeezed Alexander's hand. "Whatever happens," she said softly, "we're in this together." Alexander nodded, grateful for her steady presence. It still amazed him how quickly they had fallen back into a partnership, their shared concern for Charlie, bridging years of distance and pain. Dr. Harriman, a kind-faced woman with salt and pepper hair, greeted them warmly. "Hello, Charlie. How are you feeling today?" Charlie shrugged, settling into the armchair across from the doctor. "Okay, I guess. I had that dream again last night." "Doctor?" Harriman leaned forward, her expression encouraging. "The one about the car and the water. Did you remember anything new?" As Charlie began to recount his dream, adding small details that seemed to surface with each retelling, Alexander and Catherine listened intently. Every new piece of information, no matter how small, felt like a clue in the mystery of Charlie's true identity. "And then," Charlie was saying, his brow furrowed in concentration, "I heard a voice. It was calling a name, but it wasn't Charlie. It sounded like Jamie." Alexander felt his heart skip a beat. Jamie. That had been Catherine's nickname for James when he was little. Dr. Harriman nodded encouragingly. "That's excellent, Charlie. These details, even if they seem small, can be very important. Now I'd like to try something new today if you're comfortable with it. It's called guided imagery. It might help us access more of your memories. Are you willing to give it a try?" Charlie looked to Alexander and Catherine, seeking reassurance. At their nods of encouragement, he turned back to Dr. Harriman. "Okay, I'll try." What followed was an intense hour of careful questioning and gentle prodding of Charlie's subconscious. Alexander and Catherine watched, hardly daring to breathe, as Charlie described fragments of memories, a toy boat in a bathtub, the smell of cinnamon and apples, a lullaby sung in a voice that sounded achingly familiar to Catherine. As the session wound down, Dr. Harriman turned to Alexander and Catherine. "This is promising progress," she said cautiously. "But I want to stress that memory recovery, especially in cases of potential trauma, is a delicate process. We need to be patient and not push too hard." Alexander nodded, feeling a mix of hope and frustration. "And what about the DNA tests? When will we have those results?" "The lab is expediting them given the unusual circumstances," Dr. Harriman replied. "We should have preliminary results in a few days." As they thanked the doctor and showed her out, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the cusp of a major breakthrough. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together, but the final picture remained tantalizingly out of reach. Later that evening, as Alexander tucked Charlie into bed, the boy looked up at him, with those startlingly familiar blue eyes. "Mr. Alexander," he said hesitantly, what if I'm not really James? Will you and Mrs. Catherine be disappointed?" Alexander felt his throat tighten with emotion. He sat on the edge of the bed, gently smoothing Charlie's hair. "Charlie, listen to me. You are an amazing, brave, wonderful boy. Whether you turn out to be James or not, that doesn't change. Catherine and I care about you for who you are right here and now. Nothing could make us disappointed in you. Understand?" Charlie nodded, a small smile playing at his lips. I think I'd like it if you were my dad, and if Mrs. Catherine was my mom. Is that okay?" "Oh, Charlie," Alexander said, pulling the boy into a tight hug. "That's more than okay. That's everything." As he held Charlie, feeling the boy's small arms wrap around him in return, Alexander sent up a silent prayer of gratitude. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever truths the DNA tests might reveal, he knew that his heart had already made its decision. Charlie was family now and always. With a final good night, Alexander left Charlie's room, closing the door softly behind him. He found Catherine waiting in the hallway, her eyes questioning. "He's okay," Alexander assured her. "Just a bit overwhelmed by everything, I think. Aren't we all?" Catherine nodded, reaching out to take his hand. "Alexander," she said softly, "whatever happens next, I want you to know, I'm glad we're facing this together. I'd forgotten how strong we can be as a team." Alexander felt a warmth spread through him at her words. "I'd forgotten too," he admitted. "But I'm grateful to be reminded." As they made their way downstairs, both lost in thought about the uncertain future ahead, neither of them noticed the shadow that passed by Charlie's window, a figure that paused, peering inside with an intensity that would have chilled them to the bone had they seen it. The mystery of Charlie's identity was far from solved, and forces beyond their understanding were beginning to take notice. The Blackwood family's journey was only just beginning, and the road ahead promised to be filled with more twists and turns than any of them could have imagined. The following days passed in a haze of anticipation and nervous energy. The Blackwood mansion, once a sanctuary of solitude, now felt like the eye of a storm, a fragile bubble of calm surrounded by swirling questions and uncertainties. Alexander found himself constantly checking his phone, jumping at every ring, expecting it to be the lab with the DNA results. Catherine threw herself into researching child psychology and trauma recovery, her wheelchair surrounded by stacks of books and printouts. And Charlie, caught in the middle of it all, seemed to oscillate between moments of carefree childhood joy and periods of quiet introspection that broke Alexander's heart. It was during one of these quiet moments that Alexander found Charlie in the attic, surrounded by old boxes and dust-covered furniture. "Charlie," he called softly, not wanting to startle the boy. "What are you doing up here?" Charlie looked up, his blue eyes wide and serious. "I was looking for more clues," he said, "about who I am, or who I might be." Alexander's heart clenched at the uncertainty in the boy's voice. He made his way through the cluttered space, settling down next to Charlie. "Find anything interesting?" Charlie shrugged, then hesitated. "Maybe. Look at this." He held out a faded photograph, creased and worn at the edges. Alexander took it, his breath catching as he recognized the scene. It showed a much younger version of himself and Catherine, standing in front of the mansion. Catherine was holding a toddler, James, and they were all smiling at the camera. "That's you and Mrs. Catherine, right?" Charlie asked. And James?" Alexander nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Charlie leaned in, pointing to something in the background of the photo. "But look there, behind you, who's that?" Alexander squinted, following Charlie's finger. In the shadows of the porch, barely visible, was a figure. A man, it seemed, watching the family from a distance. I'm not sure," Alexander said slowly, a chill running down his spine. "I don't remember anyone else being there that day." Charlie's face scrunched up in concentration. "He looks familiar somehow, like someone from a dream." Before Alexander could respond, Catherine's voice called up from below. "Alexander! Charlie! Are you up there? Dr. Harriman is on the phone." They scrambled down from the attic, the strange photograph tucked safely in Alexander's pocket. In the study, Catherine was speaking animatedly into the phone, her face alight with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Yes, of course. We'll be there first thing tomorrow morning. Thank you, Doctor. As she hung up, Alexander and Charlie looked at her expectantly. The preliminary DNA results are in, Catherine said, her voice trembling slightly. Doctor, Harriman wants us to come to her office to discuss them in person. A heavy silence fell over the room, the weight of possibility almost tangible in the air. What do you think it means? Charlie asked in a small voice. That she wants to tell us in person. Alexander knelt down, placing his hands on Charlie's shoulders. It means we're one step closer to answers, buddy. But remember what we talked about. No matter what those results say, you're part of this family now, okay? Charlie nodded, a small smile playing at his lips. Okay. As they prepared for bed that night, the atmosphere in the mansion was charged with nervous energy. Alexander found himself unable to sleep, pacing the halls like a restless ghost. As he passed Charlie's room, he heard a soft whimper from inside. Gently pushing the door open, he found Charlie tossing and turning, caught in the throes of another nightmare. No, the boy mumbled, his face scrunched in distress. Don't take me away. Charlie, Alexander called softly, moving to the bed. Charlie, wake up. It's just a dream. The boy's eyes flew open, wild with fear for a moment before focusing on Alexander's face. Mr. Alexander, he whispered. I'm here, buddy, Alexander soothed, sitting on the edge of the bed. Bad dream? Charlie nodded, his small body still trembling. I was in a dark place and someone was chasing me. They kept saying I had to go back, that I didn't belong here. Alexander felt a chill run down his spine, remembering the strange figure in the photograph. It was just a dream, Charlie. You're safe here, I promise. As he comforted the boy, a movement outside the window caught Alexander's eye. A shadow, quick and elusive, darted across the moonlit lawn. By the time Alexander made it to the window, whatever it was had vanished into the night. Unsettled, he turned back to Charlie, forcing a reassuring smile. How about some hot chocolate? Might help chase away those bad dreams. As they made their way to the kitchen, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The mansion, once a symbol of isolation, now felt exposed, its secrets laid bare to unknown eyes. In the warm glow of the kitchen, as Charlie sipped his hot chocolate and Catherine joined them, drawn by the late-night activity, Alexander tried to push away his unease. Tomorrow would bring answers, or at least some of them. The DNA results would either confirm their wildest hopes or force them to face a different reality. But looking at Charlie's face, at the trust and love shining in those familiar blue eyes, Alexander knew that some truths transcended biology. Whatever the test results revealed, whatever shadows lurked in their past, this unlikely family unit had forged a bond that couldn't be easily broken. As the grandfather clock chimed midnight, heralding the arrival of a new day full of potential revelations, Alexander made a silent vow. He would protect Charlie and Catherine with everything he had, against nightmares, against mysterious figures from the past, against anything that threatened the fragile happiness they had found. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with potential dangers and heartaches, but for the first time in years, Alexander felt ready to face whatever came their way, because now he wasn't facing it alone. They were in this together, a family, unexpected and unconventional, but stronger for it. As Charlie's eyes began to droop, the warmth and safety of the kitchen lulling him back to sleep, Alexander and Catherine shared a look of understanding. Tomorrow would bring what it would, but tonight, in this moment, they were together, and for now, that was enough. The January morning dawned cold and grey, a fitting backdrop for the emotional storm brewing within the Blackwood family. Alexander gripped the steering wheel tightly as he navigated the winding road to Dr. Harriman's office, hyper-aware of Charlie fidgeting nervously in the back seat and Catherine's tense silence beside him. As they pulled into the parking lot of the nondescript medical building, Alexander caught Charlie's eye in the rearview mirror. "Remember, buddy," he said softly, "no matter what we learn today, nothing changes how we feel about you. Okay?" Charlie nodded, his small face a mixture of hope and fear. "Okay, Mr. Alexander." The walk to Dr. Harriman's office felt like the longest of Alexander's life. Each step brought them closer to answers they had been both craving and dreading. As they entered the waiting room, Alexander felt Catherine's hand slip into his, a gesture of solidarity that nearly undid him. Dr. Harriman greeted them with a warm but serious smile, ushering them into her office. "Thank you for coming in," she said, gesturing for them to sit. "I know this has been a difficult and emotional journey for all of you." Alexander nodded, unable to form words past the lump in his throat. He felt Charlie press closer to his side and instinctively wrapped an arm around the boy's shoulders. Dr. Harriman took a deep breath, her eyes moving from Alexander to Catherine to Charlie. "I've received the preliminary results of the DNA test," she began, "and I have to say they're quite extraordinary." The tension in the room was palpable. Alexander felt as if his heart might burst from his chest. "The results show," Dr. Harriman continued, her voice gentle but clear, "a 99.9% probability that Charlie is, in fact, your biological son. In other words, Charlie is James." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Alexander heard Catherine's sharp intake of breath, felt Charlie stiffen beside him. For a moment, time stood still as the magnitude of the revelation washed over them. But how?" Catherine's voice broke the silence, thick with emotion. "We were told, we thought—" Dr. Harriman held up a hand. "I understand this is overwhelming. The how and why are still unclear. But the genetic evidence is undeniable. Charlie, or James, is your son." Alexander looked down at the boy beside him. His son, his James, alive and here after all these years. Charlie, James, looked back up at him, his blue eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and dawning recognition. "Does this mean—" the boy began hesitantly. "Does this mean you're really my mom and dad?" Catherine let out a sob, reaching out to pull Charlie into her arms. "Oh, my darling boy," she whispered. Yes, we are." Alexander enveloped them both in his embrace, tears streaming down his face. The joy, the relief, the sheer impossibility of the moment threatened to overwhelm him. His son, his James, returned to them like a miracle. As the initial shock began to subside, questions flooded Alexander's mind. "But Dr. Harriman," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion, "how is this possible? We were told James, that he had passed away in the accident. There was a funeral, a body." Dr. Harriman's expression turned grave. "That's where things get complicated, Mr. Blackwood. The DNA results are clear, but they raise more questions than they answer. How James survived the accident, where he's been all these years, why he doesn't remember. These are all mysteries we've yet to solve." Charlie, James, pulled back slightly, his brow furrowed. "But I remember the orphanage, and before that, it's all fuzzy, but I know I wasn't here. How can I be James if I don't remember being him?" "Memory is a complex thing, especially in cases of trauma," Dr. Harriman explained gently. "It's possible that the accident and whatever happened afterward caused a form of dissociative amnesia. Your mind may have created new memories or altered existing ones as a coping mechanism." Alexander felt a chill run down his spine as he remembered the shadowy figure in the old photograph, the sense of being watched. "Could someone have taken him?" he asked, the words feeling heavy and terrible on his tongue. "After the accident?" Dr. Harriman's expression was somber. "It's a possibility we can't rule out, which is why I've already contacted the authorities. This case will need a full investigation to uncover the truth of what happened 7 years ago." The reality of the situation began to sink in. Their miracle, their impossible reunion, was just the beginning. There were still so many questions, so many potential dangers lurking in the shadows of the past. As if sensing the shift in mood, Charlie, James, spoke up, his voice small but determined. "It's okay if I don't remember everything right away, isn't it? I mean, I know you're my mum and dad now. I can feel it. Isn't that the most important thing?" Alexander felt his heart swell with love and pride. He pulled his son close, marveling at the resilience and wisdom in one so young. "You're absolutely right, James," he said, the name feeling both foreign and perfectly right on his tongue. "We're together now, and that's what matters most. We'll figure out the rest together." As they left Dr. Harriman's office, stepping out into the cold January day, Alexander felt as if he were seeing the world anew. The grey sky seemed brighter, the air fresher. His son was alive, returned to them against all odds. But even as joy and gratitude flooded his heart, a nagging sense of unease lingered. The mystery of James's lost years loomed large, and Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that there were forces at work they had yet to understand. As they drove home, Charlie, James, chattering excitedly in the back seat about all the things he wanted to know about his life before the accident, Alexander caught Catherine's eye. The look they shared was one of fierce determination. They had their son back, and they would do whatever it took to keep him safe and help him recover his lost memories. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with potential dangers and emotional landmines, but they would face it together, as a family reunited against all odds. The Blackwood family had been given a second chance, and Alexander silently vowed to make the most of every precious moment. The Blackwood mansion stood silhouetted against the setting sun, its windows glowing with warm light, as Alexander pulled into the driveway. The drive home had been a whirlwind of emotions, joy, disbelief, and a growing sense of protectiveness that Alexander felt deep in his bones. As they entered the house, Martha greeted them, her eyes wide with anticipation. "Well?" she asked, unable to contain her curiosity. Alexander looked at Catherine, then at the boy between them, their son, their James. With a nod from Catherine, he took a deep breath. "Martha," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I'd like you to meet James, our James." Martha's hand flew to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. "Oh my goodness," she whispered. "It's true? Our little boy is home?" James, the name still felt new and wonderful to Alexander, stepped forward shyly. "Hi, Martha," he said. I guess I used to know you pretty well, huh?" Martha knelt down, her eyes roving over James's face, as if memorizing every detail. "Oh, my dear boy," she said softly. "You have no idea how much you've been missed." As Martha enveloped James in a warm hug, Alexander felt Catherine's hand slip into his. He squeezed it gently, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the moment. The evening passed in a blur of phone calls, tears, and laughter. Alexander and Catherine took turns telling James stories of his early childhood, showing him photographs and home videos. With each revelation, they watched closely for any sign of recognition in their son's eyes. Sometimes James would furrow his brow, as if on the verge of remembering something. Other times, he would simply listen with wide-eyed wonder, as if hearing a fantastic bedtime story. "And this," Catherine said, pointing to a photo of a grinning toddler clutching a stuffed elephant, "was your favorite toy. You called him Ellie and you wouldn't go anywhere without him." James leaned in, studying the photo intently. "Ellie," he murmured, then looked up with a start. I think I remember him. He had a red bow, didn't he? Around his neck?" Alexander and Catherine exchanged a look of excitement. "That's right," Alexander exclaimed. "Ellie did have a red bow. Do you remember anything else about him?" James screwed up his face in concentration. I'm not sure. It's like trying to remember a dream, but I can almost feel how soft he was." As the night wore on, James began to yawn, the emotional toll of the day catching up with him. Alexander scooped him up, marveling at how natural it felt. "I think it's bedtime, champ," he said softly. "Can I—" James hesitated, then continued in a small voice. "Can I call you Mom and Dad now?" Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, wheeling closer to kiss his forehead. "We would love nothing more." As Alexander carried James up to bed, to his old room, preserved all these years in the hope of his return, he felt a profound sense of rightness, as if a missing piece of his soul had finally clicked into place. But as he tucked James in, surrounded by the toys and decorations of a life interrupted, a shadow of unease crept over him. There were still so many unanswered questions, so many potential dangers lurking in the unknown years of James's absence. "Dad?" James's sleepy voice pulled Alexander from his thoughts. "Will you check under the bed? For monsters?" Alexander's heart clenched at the innocence of the request. "Of course, buddy," he said, getting down on his knees to peer under the bed. "All clear. No monsters here." As he straightened up, Alexander's gaze fell on the window. For a split second, he could have sworn he saw a figure standing in the shadows of the garden, watching the house. But when he blinked, it was gone. Shaking off the eerie feeling, Alexander leaned down to kiss James's forehead. "Good night, son," he whispered. "We love you so much." "Love you too, Dad," James mumbled, already half asleep. Downstairs, Alexander found Catherine in the study, surrounded by papers and open laptops. "What's all this?" he asked, sinking into the chair beside her. "Research," Catherine replied, her face set with determination. "We need to understand what happened to James during those lost years. And we need to be prepared for whatever might come next." Alexander nodded, the weight of their situation settling over him once more. "You're right. We can't just bask in the joy of having him back. We need to protect him." As they pored over police reports, medical journals, and case studies of missing children, a knock at the door startled them. Martha entered, her face pale. "Mr. Blackwood, there's someone here to see you. A Detective Reeves. He says it's urgent." Alexander and Catherine shared a look of apprehension. It was late for a social call, and the timing, so soon after the DNA results, couldn't be a coincidence. Detective Reeves, a grizzled man with sharp eyes, greeted them with a grim expression. "Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood," he said, his voice low and serious. "I'm here about your son, James. We've received some concerning information." Alexander felt his heart rate quicken. "What kind of information, Detective?" Reeves hesitated, his eyes darting between Alexander and Catherine. "There's no easy way to say this, so I'll be blunt. We have reason to believe that your son's reappearance may be connected to a larger criminal operation, one that's been operating in the shadows for years." The detective's words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Alexander instinctively reached for Catherine's hand, finding it already reaching for his. "What are you saying, Detective?" Catherine asked, her voice steady despite the fear Alexander could see in her eyes. "Are you suggesting that someone deliberately took our son? That his return isn't just a miracle but part of some plot?" Reeves nodded gravely. "That's exactly what I'm saying, Mrs. Blackwood, and I'm afraid this is just the tip of the iceberg. Your family's safety may be at risk." As the detective began to outline the complex web of suspicions and half-formed theories, Alexander felt the world shifting beneath his feet once more. The joy of James's return, so pure and bright just hours ago, now seemed fragile in the face of this new threat. But as he listened to Reeves, a steely resolve formed in Alexander's heart. They had lost James once before, through a tragedy they couldn't have prevented. This time would be different. This time they would fight with everything they had to keep their family safe and whole. Whatever shadows were unfolding around them, whatever dangers lurked in James's lost years, the Blackwoods would face them together. Their miracle had been hard won, and Alexander silently vowed that nothing, not criminals, not shadowy organizations, not the weight of the past, would tear them apart again. As the night deepened and Detective Reeves continued his grim briefing, Alexander's mind raced with plans and contingencies. The battle for their family's future was just beginning, and he was determined to be ready for whatever came next. The early morning light filtered through the study windows, casting long shadows across the room, where Alexander, Catherine, and Detective Reeves had spent the night piecing together the fragments of a puzzle they were only beginning to understand. Empty coffee cups littered the desk, a testament to their sleepless vigil. "So let me get this straight," Alexander said, his voice hoarse from hours of discussion. "You believe that James's disappearance might be connected to a series of similar cases across the country?" Detective Reeves nodded grimly. "We've identified at least 5 other instances of children presumed dead who reappeared years later, with no memory of where they'd been. In each case, the families reported feeling watched or followed in the weeks leading up to the child's return." Catherine leaned forward, her eyes sharp despite her exhaustion. "And you think this is all connected to some sort of organized crime syndicate?" "That's our working theory," Reeves confirmed, though their motives remain unclear. "Child trafficking, illegal adoptions, even some sort of twisted social experiment. We're exploring all possibilities." Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. The idea that his son's tragedy might be part of something so sinister was almost too much to bear. "What do we do now? How do we keep James safe?" Reeves's expression softened slightly. "For now, we keep this investigation under wraps. I've got my best people working on it, but we can't risk tipping off whoever's behind this. As for James, I'd recommend increasing your home security and limiting his exposure to the public until we know more." As if on cue, the sound of small feet on the stairs caught their attention. James appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Mom? Dad? What's going on?" Alexander moved quickly to scoop up his son, marveling again at how natural it felt. Nothing to worry about, champ, just some grown-up talk. How about some breakfast? As Alexander led James to the kitchen, he caught Catherine's eye. The look they shared was one of fierce determination. They would do whatever it took to protect their miracle. Over the next few days, the Blackwood mansion transformed into a fortress of love and vigilance. New security systems were installed, complete with cameras and motion sensors. Martha, ever loyal, took on the role of gatekeeper, vetting all visitors with a sharp eye and sharper tongue. James, for his part, seemed to flourish under the constant attention of his parents. Each day brought new discoveries, a favorite food remembered, a snippet of a lullaby hummed absently, a flash of recognition at an old toy. It was as if his mind was slowly waking up, piecing together the fragments of his past. One afternoon, as Alexander watched James and Catherine poring over a photo album in the sunroom, he felt a surge of emotion so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees. This was everything he had dreamed of for 7 long years, his family whole, happy, together. But even in these moments of joy, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that they were living on borrowed time. The shadows that Detective Reeves had illuminated lurked at the edges of his consciousness, a constant reminder of the unknown threats they faced. It was during one of these quiet moments of reflection that James approached him, a serious expression on his young face. "Dad?" he said hesitantly. "Can I ask you something?" Alexander knelt down to his son's level, struck again by those familiar blue eyes. "Of course, buddy. You can ask me anything." James bit his lip, seeming to struggle with his words. I had another dream last night, but it didn't feel like a dream. It felt like a memory." Alexander's heart raced. "What kind of memory, James?" "I was in a room," James said slowly, his brow furrowed in concentration. "A white room with lots of lights. There were people there, in white coats. They were talking about me, but I couldn't understand what they were saying. And then," he trailed off, his eyes filling with tears. "It's okay, son," Alexander soothed, pulling James into a gentle hug. "You're safe now. Can you tell me what happened next?" James sniffled against Alexander's shoulder. "One of the people came over to me. He had kind eyes, but his smile was wrong somehow. He said, 'It's time to go home now, Charlie.' But that's not my name. Why did he call me Charlie, Dad?" Alexander felt as if the air had been sucked from his lungs. This was no ordinary dream. It was too specific, too vivid. This was a piece of the puzzle they'd been searching for. "I don't know, James," he said carefully, his mind racing. "But I promise you, we're going to figure it out. Together." As James nodded and wiped his eyes, Alexander saw Catherine watching from the doorway, her face a mask of concern. He gave her a slight nod, a silent promise to fill her in later. That night, after James was tucked safely in bed, Alexander and Catherine huddled in the study, relaying James's dream to Detective Reeves over a secure line. "This is significant," Reeves said, his voice crackling with static and barely contained excitement. "It's the first concrete lead we've had. I'll have my team look into medical facilities, research centers, anywhere that matches the description." As they hung up, Catherine turned to Alexander, her eyes shining with a mixture of hope and fear. "We're getting closer, aren't we, to understanding what happened to our boy?" Alexander nodded, pulling her into a tight embrace. "We are. But Catherine, I can't help feeling that the closer we get to the truth, the more danger we might be in," Catherine finished, her voice muffled against his chest. "I know, but we can't stop now. We owe it to James to uncover the truth, no matter where it leads." As they held each other in the quiet of the study, the rest of the house sleeping peacefully around them, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the precipice of something monumental. The truth about James's lost years was within their grasp, but at what cost? Outside, unnoticed by the embracing couple, a figure stood in the shadows of the garden, watching the house with unwavering intensity. The game was entering its final stages, and soon, very soon, all would be revealed. The following weeks passed in a blur of heightened security measures and tense anticipation. The Blackwood mansion, once a symbol of isolated grief, had transformed into a hub of clandestine activity. Detective Reeves and his team had set up a command center in the guest house, coordinating their investigation while maintaining a low profile. Alexander found himself constantly on edge, jumping at every unexpected sound, scrutinizing every unfamiliar face in town. The weight of protecting his newly reunited family pressed down on him, a constant presence in the back of his mind. It was during one of these hyper-vigilant moments that Alexander noticed something odd. He was reviewing the security camera footage, a nightly ritual he'd developed, when a flash of movement caught his eye. There, at the edge of the property, a figure darted between the trees. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably human. His heart racing, Alexander rewound the footage, zooming in as much as the resolution would allow. The figure was dressed in dark clothing, face obscured by a hood, but there was something familiar about the way they moved, a grace that tugged at Alexander's memory. Before he could analyze it further, a soft knock at the study door broke his concentration. James peeked in, his blue eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "Dad, can I show you something?" Alexander quickly minimized the security footage. "Of course, buddy, what is it?" James entered the room clutching a piece of paper to his chest. "I had another dream last night, but this time when I woke up I remembered something, so I drew it." With trembling hands, James handed over the paper. Alexander's breath caught in his throat as he took in the crayon drawing. It depicted a sterile-looking room filled with strange equipment. In the center stood a group of figures in white coats, surrounding a small bed where a child lay. "James," Alexander said carefully, "can you tell me about this drawing?" The boy nodded, his brow furrowed in concentration. "It's the room from my dreams, the one with the bright lights and the people in white coats. But last night, I remembered something new. See that man there?" He pointed to a figure standing slightly apart from the others, dressed in a dark suit instead of a white coat. Alexander leaned in, studying the crudely drawn figure. There was something about the stance, the set of the shoulders. "I think he was in charge," James continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The others, they seemed scared of him. And Dad, I think I've seen him before. Recently." A chill ran down Alexander's spine. "What do you mean, James? Where have you seen him?" James bit his lip, looking uncertain. "I'm not sure. It might have been in town or maybe here. It's all jumbled up in my head." Alexander pulled his son into a tight hug, his mind racing. Could the figure from James's drawing be the same one he'd spotted on the security footage? And if so, what did it mean? "You did great, buddy," he said, forcing his voice to remain calm. "This is really helpful. Why don't you go find Mom and see if she'll make us some hot chocolate? I just need to make a quick phone call." As James scampered off, Alexander's fingers flew over his phone, dialing Detective Reeves. "We've got something," he said as soon as the detective picked up. James remembered more, "and I think we might have an intruder on the property. We need to move now." The next hour was a flurry of activity. Reeves and his team descended on the mansion, combing the grounds for any sign of the mysterious figure. Catherine and James were moved to a secure room in the center of the house, surrounded by armed guards. Alexander paced the study, feeling helpless and on edge. He'd shown Reeves the security footage and James's drawing, watching as the detective's face grew more grave with each new piece of information. "This confirms our suspicions," Reeves said, his voice low and urgent. "Whoever's behind James's disappearance, they're not done. They're watching, waiting for something." "But what?" Before Alexander could respond, a commotion outside caught their attention. They rushed to the window just in time to see two of Reeves's men wrestling someone to the ground at the edge of the property. "We got him!" one of the officers shouted. "Caught him trying to scale the back wall." Alexander's heart pounded as they raced outside. This was it, the moment they'd been waiting for, the key to unlocking the mystery of James's lost years. But as they approached the captured intruder, Alexander felt the world tilt on its axis. The figure, now unhooded and handcuffed, looked up at them with a face that was hauntingly familiar. "Hello, Alexander," the man said, his voice calm despite the circumstances. "It's been a long time." Alexander staggered back, his mind reeling. "Robert?" he gasped. "But how? Why?" Robert Kane, Alexander's former business partner and once close friend, smiled grimly. "I'm here to warn you, old friend. You have no idea what you're dealing with. James's return, it's just the beginning." As the implications of Robert's presence began to sink in, Alexander felt the ground shifting beneath his feet once more. The mystery surrounding James's disappearance and return had just deepened exponentially, and he realized with a sinking feeling that they were only scratching the surface of a conspiracy far larger and more dangerous than they could have imagined. Inside the mansion, unaware of the drama unfolding on the lawn, James sat with Catherine sipping hot chocolate. But even in the seeming safety of the secure room, a shadow passed over the boy's face. A flicker of recognition, perhaps, or a memory struggling to surface. Whatever secrets lay hidden in the depths of James's mind, they were about to come rushing to the fore, changing the Blackwood family's world forever. The study of the Blackwood mansion, once a sanctuary of quiet contemplation, now thrummed with tension. Alexander paced the room like a caged tiger, his eyes darting between Detective Reeves and the man he had once called friend Robert Kane. Catherine sat rigid in her wheelchair, her knuckles white as she gripped the armrests. "Start talking, Robert," Alexander demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "What do you mean James's return is just the beginning? What do you know about our son's disappearance?" Robert, still handcuffed but looking unnervingly calm, met Alexander's gaze steadily. "It's complicated, Alex. More complicated than you could possibly imagine. I'm not even sure where to begin." Detective Reeves leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "How about you start with why you were sneaking around the Blackwood property? Are you working with the people who took James?" A flicker of something, fear, regret, and passed over Robert's face. "No, not exactly. I was trying to protect them. To warn them." "Warn us about what?" Catherine interjected, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and desperation. Robert took a deep breath, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "There's an organization, a powerful, secretive group with ties to governments, corporations, even religious institutions. They call themselves the Guardians, and they're interested in special children." Alexander felt his blood run cold. "Special children, what do you mean?" "Children with abilities," Robert said hesitantly. "Extraordinary abilities. Telepathy, precognition, telekinesis, things most people believe are impossible. The Guardians identify these children and acquire them for study, for training, for... Well, I'm not entirely sure what their ultimate goal is." The room fell silent as the implications of Robert's words sank in. Alexander's mind raced, trying to reconcile this fantastical explanation with the son he knew and loved. "Are you saying," Catherine said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper, "that our James, that he has some kind of special ability?" Robert nodded grimly. "That's exactly what I'm saying. And that's why he was taken, why he was returned, and why you're all in danger now." Detective Reeves, who had been listening intently, held up a hand. "Hold on. This sounds like something out of a science fiction novel. Do you have any proof of these claims?" "I do," Robert replied, reaching slowly into his jacket pocket. Everyone tensed, but he withdrew only a small USB drive. "Everything I know about the Guardians is on here. Files, photos, video recordings, enough to blow this whole thing wide open." Alexander took the drive, turning it over in his hands as if it might burn him. "Why are you telling us this now, Robert? Why after all these years?" A look of deep sadness passed over Robert's face. "Because I was part of it, Alex. I helped them take James, and I've regretted it every day since." The admission hung in the air like a thunderclap. Alexander felt a surge of rage so powerful it took all his self-control not to lunge at his former friend. You were involved in our son's kidnapping. How could you?" "I didn't know then what I know now," Robert said, his voice pleading. "They told me James was special, that he needed special care and education. I thought I was helping him, helping your family. By the time I realized the truth, it was too late. They had him, and I was in too deep." Catherine wheeled herself closer, her eyes blazing. "And now? Why come forward now?" "Because they're not done with James," Robert said urgently. "His return, his apparent memory loss, it's all part of their plan. They're testing him, observing how he reintegrates. And when the time is right, they'll come for him again." The weight of Robert's revelations pressed down on the room like a physical force. Alexander's mind whirled with questions, with fear, with a desperate need to protect his son. "What do we do?" he asked, hating how helpless he sounded. "How do we keep James safe?" Robert's expression was grim but determined. "We fight. We use the information I've gathered to expose the Guardians. It won't be easy, and it'll be dangerous." But it's the only way to truly protect James and all the other children they've taken. As the adults grappled with the enormity of the situation, none of them noticed the small figure listening intently from the other side of the study door. James, his blue eyes wide with a mixture of fear and dawning understanding, absorbed every word. Flashes of memory, long suppressed, began to surface in his mind. The white room from his dreams, the men in lab coats, the tests, the other children, each with their own unique gifts. And with these memories came something else, a stirring deep within him, a power he had long forgotten he possessed. As James stood there processing all he had heard, a small vase on a nearby table began to tremble, ever so slightly. The battle for James's future, and perhaps the future of the world, was about to begin in earnest. And unbeknownst to the adults arguing in the study, their greatest asset in this fight was the very child they sought to protect. The Blackwood mansion hummed with a nervous energy in the days following Robert Kane's shocking revelations. Alexander and Catherine, their world turned upside down once again, threw themselves into action. The USB drive Robert had provided became their lifeline, a digital Pandora's box filled with secrets that both terrified and galvanized them. Detective Reeves had set up a secure computer in the study, isolated from any networks to prevent potential hacking. Alexander found himself spending long hours poring over the files, each new piece of information about the Guardians and their activities sending chills down his spine. "It's incredible," he murmured to Catherine one evening, his eyes red-rimmed from staring at the screen. "The reach this organization has, the resources at their disposal. How do we even begin to fight something like this?" Catherine wheeled closer, placing a comforting hand on his arm. "One step at a time, my love. We've faced impossible odds before. We'll do it again for James." As they discussed strategies and pored over documents, neither of them noticed the small figure hovering just outside the study door. James, his young face a mask of concentration, listened intently to every word. The more he heard about the Guardians and their interest in special children, the more fragmented memories began to surface in his mind. It was during one of these eavesdropping sessions that it happened. As James strained to hear his parents' hushed conversation, a strange sensation began to build within him. It started as a tingling in his fingertips, spreading up his arms and throughout his body. And then, without warning, the heavy study door swung open silently, as if moved by an invisible hand. James stumbled back, his eyes wide with shock and a glimmer of recognition. He had done that. Somehow, without touching it, he had opened the door. "James?" Alexander's voice, filled with concern, broke through the boy's stupor. "What are you doing up, buddy? Is everything okay?" James looked up at his father, a mixture of fear and excitement coursing through him. "Dad," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, I think I remember, and I think I can do things, special things." The next few hours were a whirlwind of emotion and revelation. James, with the halting words of a child trying to describe the indescribable, told his parents about the fragments of memory that had been surfacing, the tests in the white rooms, the other children with strange abilities, the stern-faced adults who pushed them to do more, be more. And then, to drive his point home, James held out his hand toward a book on Alexander's desk. With intense concentration etched on his young face, he made the book slide across the polished wood, coming to rest at the edge. Catherine gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Alexander stood frozen, his mind struggling to reconcile the impossible sight before him with everything he thought he knew about the world. "Oh, James," Catherine finally managed, tears glistening in her eyes. "My brave, special boy. Why didn't you tell us sooner?" James shrugged, suddenly looking very small and vulnerable. "I didn't really remember until now, and I was scared that you might not want me if I was too different." Alexander knelt down, pulling his son into a fierce hug. "James, listen to me. There is nothing you could do or be that would make us love you any less. You are our miracle, our heart, and we will protect you no matter what." As the family embraced, each lost in their own thoughts and emotions, a new resolve began to form. The Guardians, with all their power and resources, had underestimated one crucial factor: the strength of a family's love. In the days that followed, the Blackwood mansion became a hive of activity. Detective Reeves, initially skeptical of James's abilities, became a believer after witnessing a few demonstrations. He redoubled his efforts, reaching out to trusted contacts in various agencies, building a network of allies willing to take on the Guardians. Robert Kane, still under house arrest but cooperating fully, provided invaluable insights into the organization's structure and methods. His remorse was palpable, and though Alexander couldn't quite bring himself to forgive his old friend, he recognized the vital role Robert would play in their fight. Catherine threw herself into researching other cases of children with extraordinary abilities, building a database that could help them identify and potentially rescue other victims of the Guardians. And James, under the watchful and loving eyes of his parents, began to explore the full extent of his abilities. Each day brought new discoveries, new challenges, and new reasons for hope. But even as the Blackwoods prepared for the battle ahead, they knew that the Guardians wouldn't remain in the shadows forever. The organization had invested too much in James to let him go without a fight. One evening, as the family sat together in the living room, enjoying a rare moment of peace, James suddenly stiffened. His eyes went distant, unfocused, as if seeing something far beyond the cozy confines of the mansion. "They're coming," he said, his voice eerily calm. "The men in the dark suits. They know I'm awake now. They're coming to take me back." Alexander and Catherine shared a look of determination. This was it, the moment they had been preparing for. The battle for James's future, and perhaps the future of all the special children out there, was about to begin in earnest. As Alexander moved to alert Detective Reeves and set their plans in motion, he felt a curious mixture of fear and exhilaration. The road ahead would be dangerous, filled with challenges they could scarcely imagine. But looking at his son, at the quiet strength and extraordinary potential within him, Alexander knew that they had a fighting chance. The Guardians were coming, but this time the Blackwoods would be ready. This time, they would fight with everything they had to keep their family together and to shine a light on the shadows that had for too long threatened the innocent. As the first signs of movement appeared at the edge of the property, James stood tall between his parents, his young face set with determination. Whatever came next, they would face it together. A family bonded by love, strengthened by adversity, and now empowered by an extraordinary gift that might just change the world. The Blackwood Mansion, once a sanctuary of quiet grief, now stood as a fortress on high alert. Detective Reeves and his team had taken up strategic positions around the property, their faces grim with determination. Inside, Alexander and Catherine moved with purposeful urgency, years of business acumen and parental instinct coalescing into a formidable force. James sat in the center of the study, his young face a mask of concentration. "They're getting closer," he murmured, his eyes closed as if seeing beyond the walls of the mansion. 3 cars, 6 men. They're not planning to negotiate. Alexander knelt beside his son, marveling at the composure in the boy's voice. "You're doing great, James. Just keep focusing. Remember what we practiced. If things get intense, you find that safe place in your mind, okay?" James nodded, a flicker of a smile crossing his face. "I remember, Dad. I'm not afraid." "Not anymore." Catherine wheeled closer, her hand finding James's. "We're so proud of you, sweetheart. Whatever happens, we're in this together." The moment of family unity was interrupted by Detective Reeves bursting into the room. "They've breached the outer perimeter," he reported, his voice tense. "My team is engaging, but these guys, they're like nothing I've ever seen. It's like they know our every move before we make it." A chill ran down Alexander's spine as he remembered Robert's warnings about the Guardians' resources and capabilities. "They probably do," he said grimly. "James, can you sense anything about their abilities?" James's brow furrowed in concentration. "They're protected somehow. It's like there's a fog around their minds. But they're not like me. They're enhanced but not the same." Before anyone could respond, the sound of breaking glass echoed from somewhere in the mansion. Martha's voice, usually so calm and collected, rang out in alarm. "Mr. Blackwood, they're inside!" Alexander's mind raced. They had prepared for this, had contingency plans in place, but the reality of the situation was far more terrifying than any simulation. "Reeves, get James and Catherine to the safe room. I'll buy you some time." "Alexander, no," Catherine protested, her eyes wide with fear. "We stay together, remember? For a moment, Alexander wavered. The thought of separating from his family, even for a moment, was almost unbearable. But the sound of heavy footsteps approaching steeled his resolve. "I'll be right behind you," he promised, his voice steadier than he felt. "Go." As Reeves ushered Catherine and James toward the hidden safe room, Alexander moved to the study door. He took a deep breath, centering himself as he had done countless times before high-stakes business negotiations. But this was no boardroom battle. The stakes here were impossibly higher. The door burst open, revealing two men in dark suits. Their eyes, hidden behind reflective sunglasses, swept the room with cold efficiency. "Mr. Blackwood," the taller of the two said, his voice devoid of emotion. "We're here for the boy. Hand him over, and no one needs to get hurt." Alexander stood his ground, channeling every ounce of authority he possessed. "I'm afraid that's not going to happen. My son is not your property, and he's not going anywhere." The men exchanged a glance, a silent communication passing between them. "Mr. Blackwood," the second man said, taking a step forward, "you don't understand the forces you're dealing with. The boy is crucial to plans far beyond your comprehension, plans that will shape the future of humanity." "The only plan that matters to me," Alexander retorted, "is keeping my family safe and whole. Whatever you think you're doing, whatever grand scheme you're part of, it ends here." A humorless smile crossed the first man's face. "I'm afraid you're mistaken, Mr. Blackwood. This is only the beginning." Without warning, the man's hand shot out, moving faster than Alexander thought possible. He braced for impact, but the blow never came. Instead, an invisible force slammed into the two intruders, sending them crashing into the hallway. Alexander spun around to see James standing in the doorway of the hidden passage, his small hand outstretched, his eyes blazing with a power that was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. "Don't touch my dad," James said, his voice echoing with an authority far beyond his years. For a moment, everything stood still. The fallen men stared at James with a mixture of shock and, was that fear? Alexander felt a surge of pride, quickly followed by a wave of protectiveness. His son was incredible, yes, but he was still a child who shouldn't have to face such dangers. "James," he said softly, moving to stand between his son and the stunned intruders. "I should be in the safe room with your mother." James shook his head, his eyes never leaving the men struggling to their feet. "No, Dad, I'm tired of hiding. I'm tired of being afraid. It's time to face them." As if in response to James's declaration, the air around them seemed to crackle with energy. Picture frames rattled on the walls, and the chandelier in the foyer began to sway ominously. The Guardian's agents, regaining their composure, took defensive stances. "This changes nothing," the leader growled. "The boy comes with us, one way or another." Alexander stood firm, his heart pounding but his resolve unshakable. "Over my dead body." As tension mounted, and the very air seemed to hum with impending conflict, no one noticed the small, blinking device that had been slipped under the study door. A device that was counting down to 0, ready to plunge the Blackwood mansion into chaos and darkness. The storm had broken, and in its fury, the true test of the Blackwood family's strength and James's extraordinary abilities was about to begin. The world exploded into chaos. One moment, Alexander stood defiantly between his son and the Guardian's agents. The next, a deafening boom shook the mansion to its foundations. The lights flickered and died, plunging the house into darkness broken only by the eerie glow of emergency lights. "James?" Alexander called out, his heart in his throat as he reached blindly for his son. "I'm here, Dad," came the steady reply, and Alexander felt a small hand grasp his. In that touch, he sensed a current of energy, as if James's power was radiating through his very skin. Through the ringing in his ears, Alexander heard shouts and the sound of breaking glass. More intruders were entering the mansion, taking advantage of the confusion. "We need to get to the safe room," Alexander said urgently, trying to guide James back toward the hidden passage. But James stood firm. "No, Dad," the boy said, his voice calm but resolute. "I can stop this. I can feel it. My power. It's like a dam breaking." Before Alexander could protest, James stepped forward. In the dim emergency lighting, Alexander saw his son raise both hands, palms out. The air around them seemed to ripple, like heat waves off hot asphalt. The Guardian's agents, recovering from the blast, lunged forward, but they hit an invisible barrier, bouncing off as if they'd run into a wall. Their expressions of shock quickly turned to determination as they pulled out sleek, high-tech weapons. "Stand down, James," the leader called out, his voice strained. "You don't understand what's at stake. Your powers, they're not just a gift, they're a responsibility. One we've been preparing you for." James shook his head, his eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. "You're wrong. My powers are mine, and I choose how to use them." As if to demonstrate, James made a sweeping gesture. The agents' weapons flew from their hands, clattering uselessly to the floor. Another gesture, and the men themselves were lifted off their feet, suspended helplessly in midair. Alexander watched in awe and a touch of fear. This was his son, his little boy, wielding power that defied comprehension. Pride and terror warred within him. "James," he said softly, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder, "you don't have to do this alone. Remember what we talked about. We face this as a family." At his father's touch, some of the tension seemed to leave James's small frame. He nodded, never taking his eyes off the suspended agents. "Together," he agreed. Just then, Catherine's voice rang out from the hidden passage. "Alexander? James? Are you all right?" "We're okay," Alexander called back, relief flooding through him at the sound of his wife's voice. "Stay there, it's not safe yet." But Catherine, never one to stand idly by, emerged from the passage, Detective Reeves at her side. Her eyes widened as she took in the scene, the floating agents, the destruction from the blast, and James at the center of it all, glowing with power. "Oh, my brave boy," she whispered, moving to join her family. As the Blackwoods stood united, James slowly lowered the agents to the ground. They remained frozen in place, unable to move, but very much aware. "Now," Alexander said, his voice hard, "you're going to tell us everything. About the Guardians, about why you took James, about all of it." The leader of the group, his composure cracking, looked from Alexander to James with a mixture of fear and awe. "You don't understand," he said, his voice hoarse. "James isn't just special, he's the key to unlocking humanity's true potential." "What do you mean?" Catherine demanded. The man swallowed hard. "The Guardians, we're not some shadowy, evil organization. We're trying to save humanity. There's a threat coming, something beyond anything you can imagine. And children like James, they're our only hope." James's brow furrowed. I remember something, flashes. A dark sky, stars blinking out. Is that—" The agent nodded vigorously. "Yes, that's what we've been preparing for. An extinction-level event. We needed to train you, to help you reach your full potential, so that when the time comes you can help us face it." Alexander felt the world tilt on its axis. This was beyond anything he had imagined. Why the secrecy? Why take children from their families? "Would you have believed us?" the agent asked bitterly. "Would anyone? We had to operate in secret, make hard choices for the greater good." As the implications of these revelations sank in, James suddenly gasped. His eyes rolled back, and he began to tremble. "James!" Catherine cried out, reaching for her son. But James wasn't collapsing, he was transforming. A soft light emanated from his skin, growing brighter by the second. When he opened his eyes, they were galaxies, swirling with stars and cosmic energy. "I see it," he said, his voice resonating with power. "I see everything. The threat, the future, the choices we have to make." Alexander and Catherine exchanged a look of mingled awe and terror. Their son, their miracle, was no longer just a boy with extraordinary abilities. He had become something more, a bridge between humanity and the cosmos, a beacon of hope in the face of an unimaginable threat. As James's glow subsided and he blinked back to awareness, the mansion fell silent. The confrontation had evolved into something far beyond a simple fight between a family and a secretive organization. It had become a turning point in human history. Alexander pulled his family close, his mind reeling with the weight of what they had learned and what was yet to come. The storm had passed, but a greater one loomed on the horizon, and at its center stood James, no longer just a lost boy found, but a key player in humanity's greatest challenge. The Blackwood family's journey, it seemed, was far from over. It was, in many ways, just beginning. The days following the confrontation at the Blackwood mansion were a whirlwind of activity and emotion. The revelation of the true nature of the Guardians and the cosmic threat looming over humanity had changed everything. The mansion, once a fortress against unknown enemies, had become the epicenter of a new alliance. Alexander found himself in the surreal position of mediating between Detective Reeves, the Guardian's agents, and various government officials who had been brought into the loop. The study, still bearing scars from the recent battle, now buzzed with strategy meetings and intense debates about humanity's future. Catherine threw herself into research, coordinating with scientists and experts from around the world who had been secretly working on the impending crisis. Her wheelchair became a command center, surrounded by stacks of reports and humming laptops, and at the center of it all was James. The young boy, his extraordinary abilities now fully awakened, had become a bridge between worlds. He spent hours each day in deep meditation, his mind reaching out across the cosmos, gathering information about the threat they faced. On a crisp morning, about a week after the confrontation, Alexander found James sitting on the mansion's roof, his legs dangling over the edge as he gazed at the horizon. The sight made Alexander's heart clench with a mixture of pride and fear. "Hey, buddy," he said softly, settling down next to his son. "How are you holding up?" James turned to him, his blue eyes swirling with otherworldly knowledge. "It's a lot, Dad," he admitted. "Sometimes I feel like I'm drowning in information, in possibilities. But then I remember what you and Mom taught me, about family, about love. It anchors me." Alexander wrapped an arm around James's shoulders, marveling at the wisdom in his young voice. "We're here for you, James, always. No matter how big this thing gets, no matter what role you have to play, you're our son first." James leaned into his father's embrace. "I know, Dad, and that's what gives me strength. The Guardians, they thought they had to isolate kids like me to cut us off from emotional ties, but they were wrong. Love makes us stronger." As if to demonstrate, James held out his hand. A small rock lifted off the roof, floating in midair. But instead of the intense concentration James usually needed for such feats, his face was calm, almost serene. "I can feel everything, Dad," James said softly. "The earth spinning, the stars burning. And I can feel you and Mom, your love surrounding me like a shield. It doesn't limit my power. It focuses it, gives it purpose." Alexander felt tears prick his eyes. "Oh, James, you've grown so much, so fast. I just wish that I could have a normal childhood," James finished, a small smile playing on his lips. "I know, Dad, but this is my path, and I'm not afraid because I know you and Mom are walking it with me." As they sat together, watching the sun climb higher in the sky, Alexander realized that their family's journey had taken them to places he could never have imagined. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges that seemed impossible, but they would face it together, bound by a love that transcended the ordinary. Inside the mansion, Catherine called out, her voice excited. "Alexander, James, come quickly. We've had a breakthrough." Father and son shared a look of determination before heading back inside. Whatever came next, the Blackwood family was ready to face it, not just for themselves but for all of humanity. The grand ballroom of the Blackwood mansion, once a space for lavish parties and business galas, had been transformed into a command center unlike any other in history. Holographic displays flickered with real-time data from around the globe and beyond. Scientists, world leaders, and representatives from the Guardians worked side by side, united by a common purpose that transcended old rivalries. At the center of it all stood the Blackwood family, Alexander, Catherine, and James, the unlikely linchpin in humanity's greatest challenge. "The gravitational anomalies are increasing," a harried scientist reported, pointing to a series of ominous red blips on one of the displays. "We're running out of time." James stepped forward, his young face set with determination. "We're not out of time yet," he said, his voice carrying an authority that belied his years. "I've been in contact with others like me, children the Guardians had identified. We're ready to try." A hush fell over the room. This was the moment they had been preparing for, the culmination of weeks of intense planning and preparation. Alexander knelt beside his son, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Are you sure about this, James? You don't have to bear this burden alone." James smiled, a mix of childlike innocence and cosmic wisdom in his eyes. "I'm not alone, Dad. I have you and Mom. And now I have them too." He gestured to the screens showing other children around the world, each with their own extraordinary gifts. Catherine wheeled closer, taking James's hand in hers. "We're so proud of you, sweetheart. Whatever happens, know that." As the family shared a moment of quiet unity, alarms began to blare. The main screen lit up with a terrifying image, a massive dark mass, visible even to conventional satellites, approaching Earth's orbit. "It's here," James whispered, his eyes going distant. "I can feel it. The void. The thing that consumes worlds, that snuffs out stars." The room erupted into controlled chaos as final preparations were made. James was led to a specially prepared area, surrounded by advanced technology designed to amplify and focus his abilities. As James took his position, he looked back at his parents one last time. "I love you," he said simply. "Thank you for teaching me what really matters." Alexander and Catherine watched, hearts bursting with pride and fear, as their son closed his eyes and began to glow with that now familiar otherworldly light. Around the world, other gifted children did the same. A network of power and consciousness began to form, visible on the monitors as lines of light connecting across continents and oceans. James's voice, amplified and echoing with power, filled the room. "We see you," he said, addressing the cosmic threat. "We know what you are, what you've done. But this world, these people, they're under our protection." The dark mass on the screen seemed to pause, as if considering this unexpected resistance. "You've consumed countless worlds," James continued, his voice joined now by a chorus of other young voices. "Snuffed out galaxies in your hunger, but you've never encountered anything like us. We are humanity's children, born of love and hope and infinite potential." The light emanating from James grew brighter, pulsing in time with the global network of gifted children. Alexander and Catherine clung to each other, witnessing a scene that defied comprehension. "We offer you a choice," the children's voices rang out in unison. "Leave this world in peace, and we will show you another way, a way to exist without destruction, to grow without consuming. Or face us, and know that we will stop you whatever the cost." For a moment that stretched into eternity, the world held its breath. The dark mass on the screen churned and roiled, as if in internal conflict. And then, slowly, impossibly, it began to retreat. Cheers erupted around the globe as the threat visibly diminished, shrinking from the size of a planet to a moon to a mere asteroid. But James and the other children maintained their focus, their network of light guiding the entity away from Earth and towards a new path among the stars. As the immediate danger passed and the glow faded from James's skin, he opened his eyes, looking exhausted but triumphant. "It's over," he said softly. "For now." Alexander and Catherine rushed to embrace their son, tears streaming down their faces. Around them, the command center erupted in celebration, the joy of averted catastrophe mixing with awe at what they had just witnessed. In the days that followed, the world grappled with its new reality. The existence of gifted children, the truth about the cosmic threats lurking in the depths of space, the potential for humanity to grow beyond its current limitations, all of it sparked a revolution in thinking and global cooperation. The Blackwood Mansion, once a symbol of isolated grief, became a beacon of hope and learning. Alexander and Catherine, with James's enthusiastic support, transformed it into a school for gifted children, a place where extraordinary abilities could be nurtured alongside the vital human qualities of love, compassion, and family. On a warm evening, months after the averted crisis, the Blackwood family sat on the mansion's expansive lawn, watching the sunset. James, looking more like a normal boy than he had in weeks, was eagerly pointing out constellations to his parents. "You know," Alexander said, his arm around Catherine, "when we lost James all those years ago, I thought our story had ended. I never could have imagined all of this." Catherine nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Life has a way of surprising us, doesn't it? Our miracle wasn't just getting James back, it was discovering this whole new world, this new purpose." James flopped down between his parents, grinning up at them. "And we're just getting started, right? There's so much more to explore, so many more people to help." Alexander ruffled his son's hair, marveling at the perfect balance of extraordinary and ordinary in this child who had changed everything. "That's right, buddy. We've got a whole universe of possibilities ahead of us." As the first stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, the Blackwood family sat in contented silence, bound by a love that had not only weathered the greatest storm, but had grown stronger because of it. Their journey, which had begun in loss and loneliness, had led them to a future bright with promise and infinite horizons. In that moment, under the vast canopy of stars that now held new meaning and possibility, they were simply a family, extraordinary in their ordinariness, and all the more miraculous for it.